and I really want to thank you for being here. We consider it definitely an honor for your group, which we have great interest in, to be in Monroe County, and I hope you enjoy whatever time you have here. If you can come down and have some fun, we would love to help you do that. So in any way that we can help, whether it's having fun or doing hard work, we're all part of it because we're a part of what you do. Basically, one of the things that is high on our list of importance is water to Florida Bay, and you're the folks that make that happen. We all know the issues there. We all know the issues that we know. I always suspect there are other issues we haven't figured out yet. But in any case, we certainly appreciate everything that you're doing in that regard. Ernie was down a couple of weeks ago, and he brought some books with him. And we had what I consider one of the more informative meetings, I haven't told you that I remember, because he really gave us a good overview of a lot of the work that's going on. Part of it, however, were the aerial pictures of vegetative die-off after the hurricane. And to me personally, that's quite concerning, and I hope you will keep us in the loop on what Mother Nature decides to do there, because the pictures look very bad. So please do keep us in there. We know that one of the major issues right now is increasing water storage in the EAA as a result of the Florida legislature's decisions. And we know the challenging task that you have in working with our federal partners to get everything in line, so you've got to make that happen. We certainly appreciate everything that you're doing in that regard, because we recognize, as well as you do, how vitally important that is to the overall operation. And I kind of have to apologize that the final part of my moments here. We've had an unexpected need for a special Board of County Commissioners meeting. So please accept my apologies there. We really appreciate the access that you provide by coming down, and I hope we can do this many times in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello and good morning. My name is Michelle Coldiron. I am the mayor of Marathon, and on behalf of the City Council and the folks of Marathon, I want to welcome you to our fabulous city. Yesterday, I understand that the board met within our City Council chambers and discussed wastewater treatment improvements for the Keys. You actually got to tour our city wastewater treatment plant area 4. We hope that you've come to recognize that the city and the county has the resolve to improve our water quality for this fabulous place that we call home. The level of protection provided the Keys is exemplified by 3 national parks, 4 national wildlife refuges, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, 9 state parks, and 3 aquatic preserves. We are an area of critical state concern, designated as outstanding Florida waters, and we require enhanced standards for our wastewater processing to reduce effluents into the water. The city applauds the state and district's ongoing efforts to restore natural flows to the remaining natural Everglades while providing agriculture and burgeoning population of both coasts. We further applaud the state's efforts to reduce the loss of our precious water resources of tide through engineered canals and major rivers such as the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers and associated coastal estuaries. Such loss strangles the natural, agriculture, and human environments that are essential to the economy and livelihood of Florida. These projects occurred, as you well know, through the restorative efforts embodied in the comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, as we all know as SERP. Finally, as a jurisdiction whose location lies at the end of the Florida's River of Grass, just south of the fabulous ecological and fisheries resource of the Florida Bay, we will finally be assured of consistent quality, quantity, and timing for the waters that are vital sustainability of the Keys' natural environment and intertwined tourist and fisheries economy. None of this can happen quickly enough, but the Keys were an enthusiastic supporter of Amendment 1 and the Senate Bill 10, which in combination with other legislative and policy efforts will bring SERP to closure in the foreseeable future. We have seen a lack of political resolve towards an essential restoration of the Everglades ecosystem. Please don't back up. Keep water coming to the Florida Bay. Don't slow down. You currently have the Keys in the city of Marathon. Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Mayor Coldiron, and thank you, Mayor Rice. As you can imagine, we're keenly aware of the issues that you folks face every day, and I, for one, look forward to some of our newer efforts to connect with the communities down here and help educate the folks on what we're trying to accomplish, and receiving your feedback as well, because we appreciate that SB 10 and the reservoir being a step forward. There's a lot of other work that needs to get done in order to get you that water that you need, but we are very enthusiastic about what the future holds. So thank you again for appearing here today. Right, so on the housekeeping, it is Work Use Week. And if you think you're seeing a lot of purple this morning, you're right, and for good reason. In support of Water Reuse Week, recognized May 13th through the 19th, this year, many of us are wearing some kind of purple attire, especially you, Mr. Harlow, aren't you? Quite the dapper representation of, kind of Captain Reeves. All right. So we obviously appreciate your spirit, and thank you for adorning yourself in the infamous purple blazer. Reclaimed water is typically delivered through purple-colored pipes. Many of us were present on site, and we got to see the pipes and made that connection. Thus, our enthusiasm to wear purple today. When reclaimed water is used, it eases the demand on traditional, often limited sources of water. Supporting Water Reuse Week is item 21 on today's consent agenda. At this time, I'd like to call on I'm not going to go with Mr. Purple, Captain Purple himself, Clark Harlow, for a special presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Chairman. There's been a lot of talk about this jacket that I'm wearing. The history is from May of '09, Water Reuse Week. Former member and State Representative Rooney wore this jacket in, and at the end of the meeting, he had handed the jacket off. Since then, year after year, Water Reuse Week, we've handed it down to another member of the board. I was honored this last year to have the jacket. I received a lot of comments from, where did you get that? Who do you think you are? And why are you wearing that jacket? It's actually a very nice jacket, and it represents our leadership and our support for Water Reuse Week. With that being said, and there's been a lot of infighting going on from what I've been hearing, I'd like to present this to Chairman Federico. If you join me in front.
I am truly honored. Thank you. I'll do my best to work with as much enthusiasm as you have, and it's, like I said, it's a great honor. Thank you.
I still got the stack. You're good.
There you go.
Yeah, actually.
It was a transition. abstentions or disclosures on agenda items?
None, Mr. Chair.
I do. Mr. Chair, my company, Littman Family Farms, does business with Cheney Brothers on unrelated matters. Therefore, I'm abstaining from voting on consent agenda item 17.
Mr. O'Keefe?
Chairman?
Yes, sir. Do you say none? Any abstentions, sir?
Chairman?
You're breaking up there. Sorry, technical difficulties. Do you have any abstentions to the consent agenda?
I do, thank you. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult to hear. Although I do have the meeting on my webcast and the purple jacket is looking fantastic.
Thank you for your vote of confidence, sir.
I have a couple of matters that I'll be abstaining on as my law firm, Sutton Bowen, represents the following companies on matters completely unrelated to those matters on the agenda. That would be consent agenda item number 17, Cheney Brothers Inc., consent agenda item 19, Titan Florida LLC and Florida Rock Industries, consent agenda item 20A, AECom Technical Services Inc., consent agenda item 20B, Professional Services Industries Inc., and consent agenda item 26, Avison Young Inc. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Barber? Excuse me.
None, Mr. Chair.
None, Mr. Chair.
Thank you all. Okay, so moving reports, governing board committees and RAC are key in reviewing and assessing information that is digested by this board and the public. I encourage open and direct communication at each forum, and it is appropriate that items included on committee and RAC agendas are relevant to those committees and are focused on informing governing board decisions. The committees were set up with purposeful intent and must be able to hear and decipher agenda items that provide substantive and factual information to our stakeholders in the appropriate reference committee. We need to make sure that we are using committee member and public participant time efficiently and not having presentations better suited for specific forums presented multiple times or in a setting that does not relay a clear message or properly acknowledge the subject matter. I am looking forward to serving with each of you and making sure topics of importance are highlighted in the most effective format for open discussion. I'd like to take today's committee reports a little out of order. Last month, Audit and Finance was presented audits of the procurement card procedures along with the Operations and Maintenance Capital Program. I was in attendance at the meeting along with Mr. Barber, Jamie, and Sam. And I have to say the work our Inspector General does is important, and following up with staff is important. And making sure this board has all the information it needs to set policy is monumental. So, the information presented and discussed at that meeting is significantly valuable to the entire board as decision makers. Therefore, I'd like to start today with Mr. Barber and the Audit and Finance report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm on now. This is the Audit and Finance Committee report to the governing board meeting for the meeting that was held on Palm Beach. Lucy Weinberg, the district treasurer, provided an update on the investment portfolio as of the second quarter ending March 31st. Due to a more aggressive investing and by decreasing operating account balance, the district significantly improved earnings in FY 2017 by 78%. As of March 31st, the district earns $4.4 million. Staff forecasted that earnings to be at $8.8 million in FY 2018, but we're on track to be closer to $10 million. This is earnings on our accounts. 5-year treasuries were at 1.93 in March of 2017 and are now at 2.56, a 63 basis point increase, a huge yield pickup for the district. Book yield for the quarter is 2.11% versus 1.71 last quarter, a 40 basis point increase. We are earning an average of 2.4% on long-term investments versus 2.13 last quarter, a 27 basis point increase. The current portfolio breakdown reflects a low operating account balance, about 15%, which is monitored daily to assure operational needs are met. Mortgage-backed securities are at 30%, which is the cap, and agency bonds are at 40% below the cap of 80%. The district's outside auditor, Mr. Brett Friedman, RSM US LLC, discussed the FY 2017 comprehensive annual financial report conducted by RSM. The annual independent financial audit was performed to fulfill the requirements of Part 3, Chapter 218 Florida statutes. The audit examined the financial records and statements of the district in order to form opinions of the district's financial statements. RSM concluded the district compiled in all material respects the requirements of Section 218, 415 Florida Statute Local Government Investment Policies during the year ending in September 30th, 2017. The committee unanimously approved the FY 2017 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Next, Inspector General Tim Behrens presented the IG's findings for the audit of procurement card transactions and the audit of O&M capital improvements. Because of the importance of this discussion, I asked that this be included as a separate item on the agenda. So at this time, I'd like Mr. Behrens to come up and provide us a report on these two audits. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. The first audit, I'll briefly go over the procurement card audit. The objective of this audit was to determine that the charges were for legitimate district business, that we had adequate supporting documentation for those charges, as well as determining that they were properly recorded in the district's accounting records. The audit results were, we found that the P card, the controls of them were adequate to ensure that the transactions were incurred for district business. We did not find any inadvertent purchases by employees using the district P card. Reason for inadvertent, occasionally sometimes someone makes a mistake, pulls out their district card and then realizes it later. In that situation, we have a process, they just go reverse the district for that. We didn't find any coding errors. However, we did find one control needed some reinforcement, and that was the employees to sign off on their statements as well as their supervisor sign off. We found a number that were not being signed off. The audit of operations and maintenance program. To start with this one, the primary objective of this was to determine that the program is meeting the district's flood control mission. To start, it helps to give a little historical perspective on this. We had first audited this program back in 2001. And back then, we really did not have any formal O&M program. Back then, for example, the 2000 budget was $9 million. The 2001 budget was $13 million. And the recommendations that came out of that report was that we needed to develop a life cycle inventory of all the infrastructure, and we needed to perform routine engineering inspections, and that the program needed significantly more funding. Well, fast forward to today, we now have a process in place where the structures are all inspected on a 5-year cycle. They use a risk-based approach and it's a ranking from a C1 to a C5, a C1 being no deficiencies to a C5 being major deficiencies. And I would note that over the last 5 years, the staff has done a great job in significantly reducing the, the major deficiencies from 78 to only 3, and the C4s from 91 down to 42. The funding over the last 5 years has ranged from $54 to $62 million. Big increase from where we were back in 2000. Also, it was increased, it's been being increased a little bit each year. In 2018, it was increased by $3 million. There's been an additional $2 million proposed for the 2019 budget. Also, I would point out that some of the initiatives of the O&M are also included in some other district programs, such as the vegetation canal bank removal is included in our vegetation management program, but that is also part of our flood control mission to remove the major vegetation, because when that falls in the canal, that's the major problem that we deal with conveyance. However, on the canal and levees, as far as funding goes, that's 2 areas that we need to look at to make sure that we have sufficient funding for those areas in the future. There was one analysis staff had done that estimated that over the next 20 years that the canals may need up to $18.5 million annually, and that the levees over the next 5 years, $10 million. Currently, though, they are doing, they're assessing the canal conveyance, determine if any dredging needs to be planned. However, an initial canal evaluated down in Miami-Dade County, they determined no additional dredging was needed. And what they're focusing on is, as the canals are today, do they have sufficient capacity versus what they were originally designed for? We also do have an in-house dredging program where we do have the dredger equipment and 1 crew who can do this in-house at a lower cost than contracting it out. Also, on the East Coast Protective Levee, which is one of the most key levees that we have that protects our southeast coast here, it was determined to be in full compliance with federal regulations. Also, when a deficiency is determined, staff determines whether it's something that can be addressed by our field station technicians or whether we need to contract that out. As the larger major programs, usually we have to go and contract those out. And so usually the smaller repair type items go to our field station. One thing that we found is we use our SAP system to set up work orders to track all these, and we found that sometimes the SAP system was not always kept up to date with current information. Someone may have gone out and done the repair and forgot to document it in the system, and so we made some recommendations to shore that up, and O&M has put some controls in place and reinforced some existing controls to address those issues. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, and I do want to compliment you on your report. I know you spent a lot of time, you and your staff, on it, and great work. Thank you. You know, when I first came on this board 8 years ago, we were starting to cut back on the budget, and so we on the board were told that the O&M capital improvement was scheduled to be ramped up to about $80 million a year, but we weren't going to do that right away. We were going to delay it for a couple of years and see how it went. But I was told by the then executive director and the chief engineer and other staff members that if we postponed ramping up the O&M capital improvement for more than 2 years, that we might be putting the system at risk. And of course, now the system is over 70 years old. And back in the day, in 2001, when we didn't have an O&M capital improvement budget, we had $400 or $500 million in unrestricted reserves. So if any problems came up, we could deal with them because we had the money. Of course, those unrestricted reserves are gone now. We spend them on projects, and our unrestricted reserves is much less. My concern with the O&M capital improvement is that if we don't adequately fund it, we put people's lives and property at risk. And so I understood your conclusion to be, when I read the report, that we were $35 million short per year in funding for O&M capital improvement. Was that your conclusion?
Yeah, this was, it was an assessment that was actually done by our staff, that these numbers were based on them. And it was, the major difference was primarily in the canal and levee area. What we're currently spending on structures is right about what we're currently budgeting.
So how much more money do we need per year in O&M capital improvement budget to do the job properly?
Based on, that was one analysis that was done, and they came up with needing 18 million for a 20-year period on canals, 10 million on levees per year.
And
Right.
10 million per year on levies.
Right. Currently, in management's response though, they feel like they don't need that amount of money currently, they can do it for us.
So
That's,
it's $28 million a year more that we need in order to properly maintain.
that would be, that was the one analysis that was done by staff.
But
Yeah,
your
so,
analysis
and-
was done.
Well, the thing was 54 million. If you look at it where we're at currently now at 62, the difference between 88 is more like about 25.
Okay, so 25 million more a year.
Right, based upon that analysis.
Okay.
That was
You know, that's what I knew, and that's what I had learned over my years on this board, and that's a significant amount of money year after year. And I would just ask you to do this audit because I thought it was important for us on the board to know that our core function, which is flood control, requires that the O&M capital improvement budget be at an adequate amount so that we don't risk the system failing, resulting in risk to folks' lives and property. So I want to thank you for doing that, and I want to challenge my fellow board members to see if we can find a way to overcome this fiscal shortage of 28 million or 35 million or whatever it is per year that we need to adequately maintain our flood control system. So thank you. I appreciate your work, Ted.
But, I mean, the one thing, one thing that was a clear conclusion the management agrees with is that the program needs more funding. When you say more funding, it begs the question, how much? That was the reason, because someone's going to ask it if we didn't, use some analysis that was done that came up with those numbers. But the bottom line, definitive conclusion is the program does need more funding. How much, can be a debatable issue, but that is one conclusion that's clear that management agrees with.
But the different analyses.
There were 5 years ago, there were 78 structures that were ranked as a C5, which is a major deficiency, and that's been reduced down to 3.
Right, so now we've got that number down to
I'm currently
3 at
working
this
on those
point.
3. So.
Right, and staff, and John, I hope in your embellishment on this, that you mentioned, why you've left those 3, because you've given us some explanations on why there are 3 and how you approach those and how you approached the, getting that 78 down to 3, which I think is a pretty major accomplishment. So I'll look forward to hearing about that.
Okay, Mr. Mitnick, would you like to provide us with a little bit of a different perspective on this?
As the Inspector General said, I guess I'll start off with management wholeheartedly agrees that the O&M capital program needs additional funding in the coming years. As Tim phrased it, that conclusion begs another question: what is that number? I think last year you saw staff's recommendation to the board, and the board approved an additional $3 million added to the capital program. I think as we look to work with you to develop the next fiscal year budget for 2019, staff is again proposing additional increases on both $1.5 million to the O&M capital program and $1.5 million to Joel's maintenance efforts. In looking at the overall program, when you talk about structures, canals, levees, it's more than just the amount of money that you allocate to the O&M capital program. It's also about the amount of money that you allocate towards Joel's maintenance efforts, and especially in the realm of vegetation. Quick example, as the board is aware, you had several conversations about vegetation management throughout the entire system. Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, other lands in public ownership throughout the system. That funding comes from other sources other than the O&M capital program. There's vegetation maintenance that goes on within the field stations. When we talk about the canal program, the Inspector General referenced an analysis that the staff had done. That analysis was done back in 2015. It was relatively simplistic, rudimentary analysis. It just ubiquitously assumed that canal banks needed to be stabilized. As we've gotten farther into those investigations since 2015, you start to find out that the canal system itself has sufficient conveyance capacity. One of the other funding initiatives that we'll be working on for the next fiscal year's budget is the flood protection level of service program that you've heard about from McKean and what he's been doing specifically over in the Big Cypress Basin. They've done a lot of work there. So under that program, they're hopefully, Mr. Barber, wrapping up the efforts in BCD here in the next month or two. They've completed an analysis for the C4 basin in Miami-Dade County. They've completed an analysis for the C7 basin a little bit farther to the north, and we've got work underway for 8 and 9 basins also in Broward County. A lot of the conclusions that additional investigation that is taking that 2015 effort and advancing it is showing that from a conveyance capacity standpoint, the canal system is doing its job. And what we'll be talking about is layering on top of that sea level rise and those types of issues. But the conveyance capacity of the canal system, so far from the ones that we have looked at, has sufficient capacity in it to deal with its design objectives. So what that leaves you with then is the canal banks. And over the last 5 years, the same duration as what the Inspector General's report was on, the agency has spent somewhere around $80 million on canal and levee repairs. Roughly $60 million of that was associated with just canals. Things like the Hillsborough Canal that Ms. Peterson, you had mentioned, going in there and reshaping and restabilizing those canal banks. So we've got a number of efforts going through. Again, progressing those analysis that were done back in 2015, looking into them, taking the next step. Mr. Weisenberg, your question about the 3 remaining structures that are rated as C5. 2 of them are already in construction. One, again, is on the Hillsborough Canal. The other is in Miami-Dade County and is being replaced by DOT. We've partnered with DOT to use some of their funding to help repair and replace that culvert itself because it's part of a roadway system. The final culvert that is still rated C5 is located within the water conservation area and one of the levees just north of the S333 structure, right at the southeast corner of Water Conservation Area 3. Eventually, that culvert is scheduled to be replaced as part of the Central Everglades Planning Project. So that entire levee and that entire culvert will be removed. So those are the 3 that are currently rated as C5. What we have been doing, as Mr. Byrne said, for the structures is slowly whittling those down. And I understand, Mr. Moran, your points about the conversation that took place in July of 2011 that led to the first reduction in the O&M capital program. And your statement was right on. At that point in time, they felt that it was 2 or 3 years. You'd be able to sustain that reduced level of funding, then you started having to ramp back up. What I think we found over the last 7 years, 8 years, is that even with that reduced level of funding, we've been able to still manage the C4s and the C5 rated structures and keep them continually reducing and not increase that backlog of structures getting to that level of a deficiency. So we've been able to with the less that we got. However, as I started in my comments, it is management's recommendation that funding for the program, overall program, needs to be increased gradually over the next several years.
Thank you, Mr. Mitnick. Do we have any questions, you guys, for Mr. Mitnick? Okay, with that being said, I'd like to ask Mr. Barber to continue with the Big Cypress Basin Board report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This report's for the April 26, 2018 Cypress Basin. After Stephen Collins, the real property director, presented a proposal to convey land by Lake Trafford to Collier County, the Basin Board approved this transfer and directed staff to move forward. John Mitnick and Tom Sutterfield presented an overview of the district's security audit of the SCADA system completed in 2014, along with
Years of service. I think they were extremely beneficial to the decision-making that we had to go on here on the board. I know that the RAC invitees are greatly appreciative of your sacrifices. So since RAC, as a fact-finding body, serves an important function, if he's willing, I'd like to ask Mr. Tucker to step into the role of RAC facilitator. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your confidence and trust in allowing me to facilitate a very important committee, and also wanted to express my personal thanks to Mr. Moran as well for his service and sitting alongside him for the last year. I've had a great deal of enjoyment serving with you, sir, so thank you for that. So now it's my privilege to give the report. Our public forum was held on May the 3rd at district headquarters. Aquino Ocean have provided an update on current water conditions in Lake Okeechobee discharges. John Mitnick will provide a report to the board later on today's agenda. RAC member comments included a note from the FWC representative stating the agency hit its low water criteria in early April and has a closure in the northern portion of the Everglades Wildlife Management Area to monitor for muck fires. A report of record low water levels and active enforcement of year-round water restrictions in the Caloosahatchee area as well. Then we have this portion of RAC called Around the Table, where all the stakeholders go around and discuss important issues. Invitees expressed appreciation for Mr. Moran's 4 years of service as RAC chairman. Comments made reference to FWC's April commission meeting and Everglades panel in which Mr. Marks and Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds participated. FWC wants to remain heavily engaged in Everglades matters. Management of the lake was discussed, specifically burning to protect the lake's health and sustaining tourism. The presentation provided an update on the implementation of the approved projects. RAC invitees expressed support of the cooperative program and the goodwill it provides. Invitees inquired about any unexpended program funding. RAC was informed that this item will be presented at the June governing board where staff will seek direction. Finally, our South Florida fire conditions report. This final report was provided by Mr. Roy Feeney. The presentation provided an overview of vegetation management through controlled burns. District-wide, 76,124 total acres have been burned. These numbers reflect collaborative efforts with other agencies. RAC invitees discussed fire management on district lands, inquired about combining resources from other agencies to help in these efforts, along with assisting with public outreach. Invitees brought attention to the southeast corner of Lake Okeechobee, known as Burn Area 6, and stated that current conditions make this area prime to burn now. Our next RAC meeting will be held on June the 7th at district headquarters. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to ask Ms. Peterson to present our Project and Lands report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This month's Project and Lands Committee was held yesterday at the City of Marathon's council chambers, followed by a site visit to the Marathon wastewater treatment plant. I was joined by my fellow committee members, Brandon Tucker, Jamie Weisinger, and Governing Board Chairman Federico Fernandez. Florida House Representative Holly Rashine, District 120, also stopped in to participate. I'd like to thank the City of Marathon for hosting our meeting, Kent Nelson, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer for Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, and Dan Souse, City Director. To restore health and economic vitality of nearshore waters, the City of Marathon undertook a major wastewater and stormwater improvement project. This project originated from a need to eliminate septic tanks and illegal sewage sites. Kent Nelson provided a presentation on the status of the regional wastewater project. Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority has 6 discrete central wastewater systems located throughout the Florida Keys. As of May 1st, 69% of all potential equivalent dwelling units in the region are connected to central water sewer. Dan Souse provided a presentation on the centralized wastewater system. The city evaluated treatment options and determined that a combination of vacuum, gravity, and force main was the most cost-effective. 8 service areas were identified, along with the appropriate collection and treatment systems for each area. Following the presentation, we visited the City of Marathon's wastewater plant. Key takeaways of this meeting were that the county's total and complete buy-in and support of switching from a septic system to a centralized wastewater system, the local city's partnership with the county to push for a shift in the way residents viewed septic systems, and the effort to educate them on how those outdated septic systems were harmful to people and the environment, the multi-jurisdictional commitment to implement and fund the program, and the pride associated with the accomplishment. Monroe County is an example of how communities can identify a water quality issue, research its root cause, and band together to resolve the issue. I want to thank all of you for hosting us yesterday, and some of you are here today, and the board really appreciated that in-depth look at the project and the successes, and just walking outside of this hotel and seeing the water quality around us, and even the drive down here as soon as you get on A1A. It's very clear that that effort has paid off in spades, and you should be proud of yourselves, and we're very proud to be partners with you on everything that you do down here. It's a prime example for many coastal communities to follow suit and maybe take your lessons learned and do the same. So that concludes my report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Melanie. And again, I want to reiterate how helpful it was to participate at Project and Lands down here in the Keys, and I look forward to the next opportunity. I'd like to call for the approval of the minutes for the April 12th meeting. We have a motion. All in favor? Motion passes unanimously. I'm sorry, Dan, I didn't hear. Is he still there? There you go. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the consent agenda. Tia, I'd like to ask if we have any public comment on the consent agenda.
Yes, sir, I have one. Randy Brown.
Mr. Brown, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Beth. My name is Randy Brown. I'm the Utilities Director for the City of Pompano Beach, Florida, and the President of Water Reuse, Florida. Reuse is our passion, and it protects the environment and provides for a sustainable water supply. Florida is #1 in the country for reuse. Even though we're #1, we can't stay resting on that laurel. We have to continue to find ways to use reuse for beneficial purposes versus disposing of water and just using it once. One such effort is water reuse. Florida's establishment of the Potable Reuse Commission in collaboration with American AWWA and the Florida Water Environment Association to create a framework for potable reuse in the state, both direct and indirect. Potable reuse isn't for everyone, but it's another tool in the toolbox for water resources for our communities. We want to help them get there, and we want to provide a regulatory framework in place to ensure it's done properly to protect public health and the environment. Water Reuse Florida thanks South Florida Water Management District for being members of Water Reuse Florida, and also for your support of the Potable Reuse Commission. We need to educate everyone on the benefits of reusing our water. The astronauts in space drink it, as do the people in Big Springs, Texas. When El Paso Water stopped using reuse as part of their raw water supply, the community called in and said, "We don't like the way it tastes now." They liked it better with the reuse. With increasing populations and more people are coming to realize the need to recycle our water instead of pumping more from the environment. It's not acceptable to use our water just once and dispose of it, We need to identify and invest in methods to reuse the valuable water resource over and over. Water should be judged by its quality and not by its history, because all water is reused and there is no new water. On a note, as the Utilities Director for the City of Pompano Beach, I want to thank you for funding the alternative water supply. We've been the beneficiaries of several grants over the year and enjoy working with your fine staff. The funding has helped us grow our reuse system faster than we could have with our own resources. I believe more funding should be put forth for this program. However, we are thankful for the being benefits of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randy, and I'm sure I echo the comments of the board here that in working with our utility partners, we are very encouraged when folks take a very creative and multifaceted approach to dealing with water as a resource, and anything we can do to help, please continue communicating with us and with staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, at this time, I'd like to ask if there are any board members who want to move any items on the consent agenda to discussion. Dan? Oh, okay. Great. Following up, I'd like to ask for any board comment on the consent agenda itself. No comment? All righty. That being the case, I'd like to ask for a motion to approve consent agenda's items 12 through 31, subject to the abstention of record. Do we have a motion? We have a second. All in favor? Dan?
I don't get a abstention noted.
Motion passes unanimously. Okay. As to board comment. At this time, I'd like to invite governing board members to discuss any topics. Moving on to the, after which there will be another opportunity to provide additional discussion not directly related to the agenda. Melanie.
Just one small one, since we're always talking about septic to sewer conversions, and we did have that great presentation yesterday, and as the mayor mentioned earlier, there is a new study that was released, I believe, this week, a peer-reviewed study looking at water quality before and after septic to sewer conversions. I would respectfully ask that staff possibly work with the chair at his discretion to bring that study forward. Maybe we can have a presentation to the board in the future as can be arranged.
Yes, I too was very encouraged by what we were presented with yesterday, and I know that Melanie's dedicated an extensive amount of time, as have staff, into looking into these very positive solutions to issues that plague many of our communities, especially our coastal communities and those that are situated on and about estuaries and other bodies of water. So I would like to include in our future presentations one discussions as well, any additional information that you may find relevant to supporting a lot of the points that Melanie has raised on occasion, and I think other board members have as well. So thank you for that. Sir?
So am I to understand that at this point, when we're having board comment, it's only as to the consent agenda? Or is it just general board comment?
Okay, so at this point, I would say that it would be general board comment before we move on.
Okay, very well. Then I have a comment.
Sure.
Okay. And I'd ask, I discussed this with Ava this morning, but I understand that we are putting the reservoir on the IDS, and I why we're in order for the reservoir to be fully implemented. And I wonder if you could comment on that for the board.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Moran, from our discussion this morning. There's a couple of things. The IDS is currently being updated for this year. It's updated each year, and it will be presented, the changes to the IDS will be presented at the working group meeting in June. But one of the things that we're looking at internally is bringing the EAA storage reservoir project together in the part of the IDS that looks at planning projects, knowing that it has not yet received congressional authorization, and that it is, has a slot in WARDA 2018, as we heard this week. And we're continuing to work with the Assistant Secretary of the Army and Army Corps Headquarters to answer their questions and help that move along. So that's where we expect to see it in their revised integrated delivery schedule that will come out this summer, is together with the other planning projects like Lake Okeechobee for storage north of the lake, or Western Everglades, south and west of Lake Okeechobee. But specific to the reservoir and the timing, where we did address it are in the scenarios, the schedule scenarios that we put into the main report of the post-authorization change report. And in those scenarios, we looked at the operation of the reservoir to be consistent with the interdependent work that needs to occur, such as the completion of restoration strategies. So that even if we're really efficient in constructing it together with other items, the operation would be once we completed the restoration strategies projects.
Alrighty, thank you. That is it.
We have as well. It's less clear when it comes to the federal side, so that's something I'll talk about a little bit later in my executive director report, but it's also something we've been working with on up in that we have as well. It's less clear when it comes to the federal side, so that's something I'll talk about a little bit, and through the chain of command at the Corps of Engineers. But the changes should be reflected based on the funding that we have, and then any authorizations that are out there. There's going to be, as those things start to occur and change, it was always envisioned that the IDS would be a living document, and that would change to reflect it too. So we'll be doing the changes to reflect funding this year, and then as approvals come about, I think that would be captured in any iteration in the future.
Right, and to add to that, speaking of our efforts in DC, I can completely concur that when we have messaged to our federal partners and worked on this and talked about the IDS, we've made sure it's abundantly clear that we're not working within a vacuum, and that there's a purpose to the role each of these projects play and how they're executed as well. I know I, for one, will be sure to keep the board abreast of those changes, and if there's any hiccups along the way, I'm sure staff will as well. Thank you for that question, Mr. Moreno. Thank you both for doing so. Any additional questions at this time? Sir, please.
It also has to do with funding with our federal partners. We were made aware in our monthly briefing of the fact that the Corps hasn't budgeted for their share of some of the projects that we partnership on, and that shortage so far is like $27 million. Is that per year, or is that total accruing?
You're stealing my thunder, Mr. Murray. And that would be cumulative up to this point in time for both operational funding as well as funds associated with the pump stations that we have along the South Dade corridor on the eastern part of the park. As far as their aging, they were temporary, and so there were funds that were supposed to be given to the district in order to provide for future permanent facilities in conjunction with the Corps. Add all those funds together, we're at about $25 million. If you look out into the future, about 8 to 10 years, if we were a track of not receiving funding, it would be about $108 million of funding going forward that we wouldn't receive if we don't fix this problem with our federal partners.
About it, and they're aware of it, and
They're sick of hearing me.
I'm sorry.
They're sick of hearing me.
I see. Well, keep up the good work.
It's not just him, they threw me out into the snow as well, and I can promise you, in very Jim Moran style, we don't take care of today, it's going to be a much more expensive problem in the future. So,
Stupid questions. So they haven't asked for the funding for some of the projects that we already have done the work, and we're waiting for them. Then we have the IDS, as Mr. Moran pointed out, and we're now rearranging the IDS, and then we have a post-authorization change report out there that has, so how does this affect, because we obviously are able to do projects on a better timeline and a better budget strategy, do work better, so how to, explain to me the timeline for the post-authorization, accept the EA reservoir, and then what happens if that doesn't get done? Where do we go next? Do we just start with the Northern Everglades planning, the LOWP? Like, what is the actual timeline of what we're meant to do and what we continue to do with or without them?
Okay, that's not a stupid question, that's a fantastic question. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to go into that a little bit. And if I may, I would like to send you all more detail through email. So in terms of, I'll try to take one at a time. In terms of the EAA storage reservoir project, the timeline associated with that is we are working feverishly with the ASA and Army Corps headquarters in order to get the answers to their questions for getting it into WRDA 2018. Should that get authorized there, that does not necessarily mean funding. As we know, there's that two-step process. We know the state of Florida has done their part. We know Senate Bill 10 included funding for Senate Bill 10. There is one more.
And we've done everything we were required to do.
Yes, ma'am.
The district has done everything to the letter of what we were required to do to then, and then some, to then present to this point of getting the PACR.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. And so we're continuing to do that. As part of the EAA storage reservoir, there's 2 tracks for the timing associated with that. So they're getting it into WRDA, which is moving forward. We're still answering questions, but they're working on getting all the information they need in order to be able to actually get it all the way into WRDA. Then there's the Jacksonville District folks that are working on the environmental impact statement, which will go out shortly. So there's 2 parts to it. There's whether the Jacksonville District is reviewing our work that we did through the whole planning process, and what they're reviewing for is whether we followed all the National Environmental Policy Act guidelines. So we did all that work, they're reviewing it. They're doing a report that will go on top of ours. So there's those 2 tracks that are going on at the same time right now.
Can you just clarify for me, it's going into the WRDA 18, but we haven't gotten the PACR signed?
Let me maybe jump in there.
Yeah.
So
It's confusing, I'm sorry. It's
right
confusing
now-
for me, I think it's
And I'm
confusing for a
sorry.
lot of people.
So right now, it's a race. So there's 2018 WRDA, I think people anticipated it would be sometime this summer. When we originally submitted the document and based on the state timeframes that were put in Senate Bill 10, they were supposed to have it approved by October 1st, 2018, and submit it to Congress at that time. Well, we've got a WRDA that's looks like it's gonna come out this summer. So their time frame has accelerated. So they are trying to work with us to get answers to questions they have along the way. Recognizing it diverges, we're doing the environmental stuff in Jacksonville, and then everybody else in the Corps throughout the nation that has specialties looking at those individual pieces of the design and engineering, so on and so forth, so that they can try and achieve that summer deadline. And so that's kind of where we are right now. If the Corps does not, my understanding is, if the Corps does not present it by a certain committee timeframe, even though there's a placeholder, then it may not make the WRDA. So that's why the big rush right now. If it doesn't make the WRDA, then you're looking at potentially another 2-year timeframe, maybe in 2020. We've also in the past gone 7 years without a WRDA, so who knows when it will be past that point in time. But if it is completed this summer and it makes the WRDA, then as Ms. Velez was telling you, it becomes a question of funding.
What other projects are in this WRDA that we're doing?
We have a packer for Kissimmee River that's included in there as well. And then Mr. Fernandez and I, we spent a lot of time in DC trying to talk with folks and have them understand some of the policy changes, one of which being how they view the cost share with the state of Florida for operations, so things like that. We are hoping to have in the language of WRDA so that we can fix the issues of reimbursement as well as future O&M costs.
Okay. So then the next part of my question was, let's just put that on a shelf and then you've got the IDS that just ticks along, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So we've got, what is the time frame for LOWP and for the Western Plan? And then we've got Waxahachie
Mhm.
coming up September, right?
Yes.
We've got the TSP for Waxahachie in September. So just give us a little guideline on that.
So for Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, the study started in 2016, so we're almost at the 3-year mark of that study, so it'll be complete next year. And we have a proposed tentatively selected plan for the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Project that we will be bringing to you for a presentation next month. We'll continue to work with local stakeholders on that one, but that's the general timeframe for Lake Okeechobee watershed, and then with the goal of getting into WRDA 2020. That would be the goal for that one. For Western Everglades Restoration Project, it's about a year behind Lake Okeechobee, so 2020 TSP is in this coming year, still in the technical work for Western Everglades, still in modeling the TSP. The proposed TSP would come later on this year, early next year, when we start hearing more definitive answers or when that project lands. For Waxahachie River Watershed Restoration Project, there was a PDT meeting yesterday that went very well, where the stakeholders learned of all the technical information related to the modeling efforts, and the costs came in as well. Everybody saw the costs and benefits. The proposed TSP is also in these next coming months, as you said, with a milestone for September. And so they're all cooking in about the same time frame, where they would be, other than EAA, which is the goal of WRDA this year, those would be WRDA 2020, should there, hopefully be a WRDA 2020.
Okay, so we just keep going in our IDS. We do what we need to do. We wait for our federal partners. If they're not ready, we just keep.
Well, and I do want to add to that. So those are the planning ones that aren't yet authorized.
Sure.
We're still moving on everything else that's been authorized. We're still moving on the IRL South. We're still moving on Biscayne Bay Coastal Wetlands. We're still moving on the C-43 project. We're still moving on everything else that's been authorized. And so the part of the funding, I just wanted to take a few seconds to talk about. It's about the ledger too. That sometimes if we're the ones that are building it, that cash is something that we have to have so that we can actually construct it, and then it goes on our side of the ledger. So there isn't always necessarily money exchanging hands. There's more that if we're in charge of construction, then that whole funding comes from state appropriations. And then if the Corps is constructing it, then that whole funding comes from the Corps federal appropriations.
Sure, and that kind of leads me to just one last comment / question. Is there a way to really identify or calculate the cost? Is there an actual cost to the delay to us? Like, how much is it costing us, whether it's in physical or economic, for these delays by the federal partners? There's got to be cost.
I can't give you an exact number. What I can tell you is we have 2018 dollars, and then every year we go out, you're going to have an additional cost to get done that. And so that has really been our message, both in Tallahassee and DC, is the projects that we have authorized that we're working on, they're not going away.
Yeah.
But the longer you postpone them, the more it costs everybody.
Okay.
So we're trying to focus folks up there and see what we can get as far as bringing dollars to the table, so that we get these things done, tick them off, and start working on some of the other projects that we know we need to do as well.
I just want to add one more point there as an additional clarification regarding the ledger. I know, having spent an extensive amount of time with Ernie dealing with this and with our federal partners, we do keep a very, very accurate ledger, and the ledger does reflect who at point in time, and there is a lag, and that was part of our talking points, and I believe our federal partners are acutely aware of that, and time is money. So we are, and we will continue to drive that point home, and I'm very confident that it is being addressed. So, do we have any other board comment at this time? Sir.
Thank you, sir. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation this morning, and Ms. Peterson, you just asked, is there a real cost? And I think a prime example of what I'm dealing with in Martin County, the C-44 project, is if you'll recall, several months ago, because of delays by the Corps on the reservoir portion of the project, which is 80% of the capability of that entire project, we had to spend $2.8 million of state taxpayer dollars to retrofit that project to be able to use the STA and pump stations when they come online here later this year. We were in Orlando earlier, a couple months ago. We had this conversation with Matt Morrison up, and I talked about this $5 to $6 million we made a request for. When would we get it? This other $2.8 million that we've had to take of state taxpayer dollars to try to retrofit it. But to add insult to injury, I find out when I'm out there at the project that the ability to even spend that $2.8 million that we have allocated and to be able to utilize that, we're having to now get Army Corps permitting to be able to complete that portion of the project, and that is being delayed as well. And so in my 11 months, coming on 12 months of being on this governing board, my greatest frustration is the brokenness of this federal process. And so coming into your position.
If I may add, Mr. Chair, about a number. So there's not only cost in dollar, cost in time, implementation, and really what suffers at the behest of all of this is the environment. And so, you know, as a natural resource manager and a scientist first, you know, we see where we could have been had we had regulars. And so the environment continues to suffer. The benefits to the taxpayers from supply continues to suffer the longer this drags out. So I think that we can try continuing to look for a leader on the federal side to help us with that as well. And I'm hopeful that
Make sure that my West Coast brethren know that you're very much top of mind, and the examples have been raised and will continue to be raised when we think about alternatives. And, we will be consistent with that messaging. Thank you. Mr. Marks, do you have any other comments?
no, sir.
Anyone else? Okay, so moving on to our discussion agenda. I'd like to call, in our technical reports, I'd like to call Mr. Mitnick to come up to the podium and then give us our water conditions report.
I'll just go with this. All right. Morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly go through the water all 5 months that we actually had above average rainfall for the first time in a while, so that was good to see. Overall, that left the month of April just slightly above average, as I said. But if you're looking at the map, if I can get the mouse up there. Maybe not. All right. And looking at the map, you can see the upper East Coast, the areas in light blue there, they receive the majority of the rain, as well as up and down the Kissimmee River Valley from Orlando down to Lake Okeechobee. What will stand out to you is Mr. Barber's neck of the woods over there on the southwest coast didn't get a whole lot of rain despite having the month of April being above average. So the majority of the rain was centered over on the East Coast. Overall, for the dry season, that puts us still below average. Howard County, you can see there in the graphic in green, that even achieved average rainfall so far to date for the overall dry season. But in total, we're about 60% of average for back to November of last year. So as you would imagine, starting up in the upper chain of lakes, all of those lakes have been receding in accordance with regulation schedules. They're all working their way down to their low points there on the graphic, starting Mean 1, which is at the bottom. We've been able, as I've said in the last several months, continuing to make releases down the Kissimmee River and working with the Corps of Engineers and the construction efforts that are going along for the restoration efforts of the river itself. Looking at Lake Okeechobee, the lake is 12.9 as of this morning, somewhere between 12.9 and 12.96 as of this morning. Over the last 30 days, the lake has come down about 0.2 of a foot. I'm sorry, 0.6, a little over more than half a foot over the last 30 days. So where that puts us, if you look at this graphic, paying attention to the blue line in there, which was 2016, and the green line, which was 2017. 2018 is represented by the red line. We're right in the middle of where we had been the last 2 years. So we're kind of splitting the difference. If you wanted to compare back to 2014, there in brown, that's roughly where we were sitting as of today. The Corps has continued to make releases to the Caloosahatchee on the order of 650 CFS. However, in reality, over the past week or so, the estuary received about 1,000 CFS of water for the past week. About 500 CFS of that was made up from Lake Okeechobee. The rest being basin runoff itself. Looking at the operations along the lower East Coast, with the exception of that average rainfall that we got in April, for the most part, the canal system along the lower East being managed for water supply purposes. Some of those rains, as you can see here, starting in the upper right-hand side, some of those rains caused Water Conservation Area 1 to just jump briefly back up above its schedule. However, it started coming back down some. On down to the next lower graphic there for Conservation Area 2, you can see it as well jumped up above the schedule, but has once again started receding. Looking at Area 3 over the left-hand side of the graphic, you can see not a lot of rain from that month of April fell over Area 3, but there was some of it and some of the inflows when the Corps of Engineers opened up the S10s and the 11s to move some of that water from Area 1 into 2 and 2 down into 3. You can see sort of on the trace there on the left-hand side, Area 3 sort of leveled off and wasn't declining as rapidly as it had been. And looking at some of the operations further down the system, going down the South Day conveyance system, we are continuing to move water out of Conservation Area 3 through the L29 canal and then around the corner down the South Day conveyance system for the purposes of water supply. In fact, we're moving that water all the way down south to right just north of the S18C structure, again for the purpose being to maintain groundwater levels for the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority and their well fields that are farther off to the east, trying to maintain the headwater there just above 2.0. We've been implementing those operations for the better part of, I want to say 2 months now. I think I reported the same thing at last month's board meeting, so those operations have continued throughout the remaining portions of the month of March. Looking at water levels on the upper East Coast, you can see the effect of some of the average rainfall during the month of April. A lot of those canal levels have significantly jumped up and are well above what a water supply consideration would be for the upper East Coast. Looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, this is one I have started presenting over the course of the dry season. This is what it looked like back in April, or the beginning of April, and you can see how it has progressed. A lot of that rainfall there along the upper East Coast changing the colors, and I'll just toggle real quick back and forth. From April, you can see Palm Beach County there in the browns, whereas when you get to the beginning of May, it's more in the yellows and normally dry conditions from the average rainfall that the county received. As far as the look ahead, it basically has been calling for above average rainfall starting into the wet season. What I can tell you for at least relative certainty is that this weekend, it's more than likely going to rain. Pretty much starting in the southern portion of the state, here in Monroe County, going up into Miami-Dade County, progressing up to the southern portions of the lake. We're anticipating some significant rainfall over the weekend, starting in late Saturday through Sunday and into Monday. So roughly right now, our forecast, I'd call it through Monday or Tuesday of next week, is calling for somewhere on the order of 2 to 3 inches of rain over the southern portions of the district over those couple of days. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Chairman. John, when you're talking about getting this rain basically south of the lake coming up and the rain that we've seen, how are we doing as far as flows on the south end of the system as this rain is building up here over the next month or so? Is that water flowing? Is there anything impeding that flow?
No, because most of those rains that occurred in April, even those average rainfalls, they were primarily in the northern Palm Beach County, upper East Coast, that neck of the woods, so to speak. The southern portions of the system, with the exception of portions of Broward County, have still had those lack of rainfall or drier conditions. Especially in southern Miami-Dade County, they didn't get as much rains as areas to the north. So I think as the rain starts to move in, we're obviously keeping an eye on it and we'll prepare the system for it accordingly. But for the majority, especially along the South Dade conveyance system, most of those levels are all down at their lower water supply limits. We were having conversations about areas in Miami-Dade County farther to the east that had been operating in the low range for other purposes, and we're going to continue to maintain them in the low operating range of their canal levels until after this rain event passes.
Thank you, Mr. Mitnick.
We have no further questions?
I'd like to invite Terry Bates to present our ecological conditions report.
Good morning. Well, as John showed you, we're at the end of the dry season, so certainly that's reflected across the Kissimmee River, really more to the previous years. We're just passing minimum flows to up in the restored portion seated off of the floodplain, and you can see the exposed sandbars around the banks of the river there. Testing. Again, I reported to you last month kind of the phenomenal, unexpected year we've been having in snailkite nesting very early in the season, especially in nesting over the last 8 years and kind of the early success. So the success we've had in 2018 has been significant to have it that many birds fledged and successful that early in the year. And the majority of that is as a result of the nesting activity in the Rotenberger, which is very unusual for us. And typically what we've seen is the nesting will kind of have 2 cycles. So we're expecting that we'll have re-nesting occurring in additional areas. Currently right now, all the way through Lake Kissimmee, we've got high activity up there on Lake Kissimmee. So we'll continue to report as we go through, but we've seen a kind of a transition with the exotic snail expansion, that the nesting season has been prolonged. So we're seeing a longer time period available for nesting. So we'll report back as we get through the end of the season for the Everglades nesting. I mentioned lake conditions continue to come down. We're higher than we were last year, but as those conditions have come down, we've got improved habitat availability for wading bird nesting on Lake Okeechobee as well. And we're also really glad to see conditions in Lake Okeechobee improving from a water quality standpoint. You know, I had showed you from the time it actually was the cycle wintertime of phosphorus levels increasing in the open water portions of the lake, that's shown there in the yellow bars. And really for the first time, we're seeing conditions back down to where we would expect to see this time of year, both from the turbidity and phosphorus levels, so that's good news for the lake. The St. Lucie Estuary, really no change from last month, no discharges from Lake Okeechobee, a little bit of basin inflow, but really not much change in salinity across the lake. We have started our oyster monitoring. We're not seeing any recovery to date with the oyster kind of rejuvenate, seagrass recovery, and this is not unexpected in very high discharges to the estuaries. It can be certainly a time lag of up to 2 years before we really start to see some recovered conditions there. It doesn't happen instantaneously, but we're continuing to monitor that. As John mentioned, the Calusa having to make those releases from Lake Okeechobee. We did see a little bit of a bump up over the last week because of rainfall within the basin, and so that resulted in kind of pushing that freshwater transition to the west, which is a good thing for the estuary. It's kind of in a sweet spot for the estuary. We are just at the point of wrapping up our water year, which runs from May 1st to April 30th. That's how we kind of measure all of our ecological conditions and performance in the STAs. I just wanted to share with you kind of the effect of all the hurricane and really high rainfall we've had. This green line here is the amount of flow which has gone through the STAs. And so we're at a point, highest amount of flow ever processed, up to 1.7 million acre feet. And just to give you a point of comparison, back in the hurricane season in water year 2005, we were at 1.5 million acre feet. So a lot of water moving through that system. The phosphorus levels we saw go up as a result of the hurricanes, again, back in the water year 2005 and 6. They're about 58 parts per billion. That's average over all of the STAs. And we expect to finish this year about 36 part per billion. You can see the blue bars are the concentrations in the inflow. So very high inflow concentrations going to the STAs. STA 3-4 is still a champ, still discharging about 11 parts per billion. And I would just remember we've got a lot of ongoing construction to expand our STA capabilities. And so again, we're still not there with completing our restoration strategies work. So we've got additional projects coming on board to be able to manage this water. Biscayne Bay salinities had started to elevate because of those very dry conditions. That little bit of rainfall to the south pushed those salinities down, and I expect with the rainfall this weekend we'll see that continue. Across the Everglades, again, wrapping up the dry season, things kind of progressively drying. We've had very good recession rates across conservation areas, which has really set up a great wading bird nesting season. I won't disappoint not sharing wading bird pictures with you. We're at that point now where the storks started nesting very early, which is a good thing because they're big birds. They take a long time to fledge. And so we're at the point here, this picture on the right is the Jetport colony. To me, it's like it's a bunch of teenagers hanging out at the mall. They're not too far away from the colony. They still go home. They still get fed by their parents, but in the next few weeks, we'll expect they'll kind of venture off into the big world. But we expect very good nesting success for especially wood storks throughout the system. Same thing with ibis, just tens of thousands of ibis nesting. We'll wait to see. We've got some very late nesters that haven't quite finished going through their cycle yet, so whether or not they're successful, but with the volume of nests that we have, we expect that to be a very, very good year for wading bird nesting as well. And I'll cover Florida Bay conditions in a minute when I go through the presentation there, but with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on this.
More questions? Thank you, Terry. With that, we've got a presentation by Monroe County. I'd like to call Rhonda Hay, Monroe County Sustainability and Projects Director, to present.
Good morning.
Welcome, and thank you for having us.
We're going to do two different ones. This one's on the Irma debris removal and a little bit about canal restoration, and then the other one will be sea level rise. Let's see here. This is a reminder, back in September, Hurricane Irma made landfall here in the Keys, Big Pine Key especially. Quick recap on some of the canals that were impacted. So we have 513 canals throughout Monroe County. We figure all of them were impacted by some level, but one particularly here in Big Pine were more heavily impacted than other areas. So here are just some pictures to show you. As a mangrove island in their backyard. We had complete and whole houses blow away. A lot of that ended up in the canals, and we're about to start a removal program to remove some of this. Here's some more from Big Pine Key. Complete devastation in the areas, especially on the eastern side of Big Pine Key. Even our canal restoration projects, that's our curtain equipment, was completely destroyed in the hurricane also. We're going to have to look at redoing some of those projects. And these are Avenue Ds. So the avenues particularly hard hit. Little Torch, not quite as hard hit, still debris everywhere. And even if you only have a tree on the end of the canal that's impacting navigation, there still heavily impacts the residents on those canals. Marathon, also very heavily impacted, particularly on the ocean side. This is where we had the complete several motorhomes come into the canals, and they're still resting there. We haven't started that program yet. So what's happened is, these were taken immediately after the storm. What's happened is now almost all of this debris has sank to the bottom. So we're going to try to get Almorada, also very heavily impacted in areas. You can see, moving a little bit farther north, Tavernier, a little bit less impacted. These are a couple of the plug canals up there. More of the lighter debris, but still a lot there. It's all on the bottom now, because it didn't go anywhere. And then Key Largo, lesser impacts, but still on the ocean side, quite a few heavily impacts. And then related to debris, we have manatees now swimming amongst debris. And we just, well, always like to include that picture there to remind people why we want to do the canal clearing. It's not just for people, it's also for the environment. Okay, so back in February, and Florida Keys Days, the DEP and Monroe County signed a memorandum of agreement for removal of marine debris. This is where DEP was going to fund the efforts. I'll step back here for a minute. So Monroe County had just went through a major street clearing program where we spent many, many millions of our own money clearing the streets. And so we were out of resources at that point. We reached for help to the state to help us with the canal clearing to come next. So the DEP agreed to step in and help us fund, at least get the program going. So they funded $6 million for Monroe County, unincorporated Monroe County. A separate $2 million each for Marathon and Islamorada to fund their debris removal. It later went into a program where we have to pay DEP back within 2 years, but still they are fronting the money for that program, and we were very thankful for that. And then what we would seek reimbursement from FEMA. We contracted with DRC to be the vendor and Tetra Tech to be the monitoring firm. So that was back in Keys Day. February it was signed. We were working with FEMA along the way. We came across was FEMA is of course funder of last resort, and when they look at reimbursement for canal clearing, they look at navigational hazards only. So what they're doing is looking at the average depth of the vessel that uses those canals, and typically down here, those are fishing boats, and the average draft of those vessels are 4 feet. So when you're looking at clearing canals, when they're going to reimburse, they're only going to reimburse for work going 6 feet below. They take the 4 feet plus add 2 feet for looking at going down 6 of the water, and everything else would be left on the bottom, unless the county went forward with that on our own. So that was some of the challenges. So while we were negotiating with FEMA, we're working through these details. We said, you know, these canals are used by everybody. We don't know if they're just used by the fishing vessels. So they told us to go ahead and do a survey and try to find, you know, 5 of the boats that might use. And so we went around and looked at some of the marinas, and we found some larger boats, yachts and fishing and shrimping boats and other big boats. And we documented that these 5 largest vessels, their draft was 14.72 feet. So we presented that to FEMA at their request, and we were hoping that we would be able to go down to 14.72 feet and be reimbursed fully for that. But FEMA has so far not approved that, and at this point, we're not anticipating that they're going to approve that. So any work that we're anticipating reimbursement from FEMA would only be down 6 feet below the surface of the water. These were the NOAA aerials. This is what NOAA flew the entire area immediately after the hurricane to base our volume estimates on. And so the estimates that we came up with were 100,000 cubic yards spread throughout the Keys, 50,000 construction and demolition, and 50,000 vegetative. And we put together a cost. We estimated the total amount to remove all debris, including sediment and sand that were deposited in many canals, was $52 million. Number of impacts, as I said, there's 500 canals. We figure all of them were impacted to some. We really counted down when we started looking at it on a case-by-case basis. 97 canals for high impact, 150 for medium, lower impact 139, and then low 127. But as I said, even if it was a canal in Key Largo, and I'm still getting calls, if there's a tree down at the mouth of the canal and it's a big gigantic tree, they're impacted just as much as anybody else in the lower Keys because they don't have navigation access either. So we have many, many residents on all these canals that are still waiting for canal debris clearing. And the definition of marine debris is basically anything except vessels, because the Coast Guard went ahead and cleared all the vessels. Approximately 2,500 derelict vessels were removed after the storm by the Coast Guard and Fish and Wildlife Commission. So we want to hand them a big thank you for doing that. And then on February 16th, a couple weeks after we signed the MOU, we did move forward with a marine debris clearing program. We started on the avenues in Big Pine Key. We're using a former prison site. Prison closed down last year, so we're using a prison site as a debris management area. There's just a photo of our kickoff event that that day. There's some photos of when they actually got started. So what we found here, Corsi Avenue is on Big Pine were the worst. A lot of debris did sink, so they were having a difficult time finding it. FEMA doesn't allow you to use sonar to find the debris, so we were out there kind of searching on our own. It's another thing. A lot of interesting things about this whole program. Little Torch is some additional removal. So some of these canals were very narrow, and so they had to bring in smaller equipment so they could fit down the canals. These are the canals that have been cleared to date. Obviously, we started out in the heavily impacted areas. So year-to-date summary is 3,000 cubic yards has been removed. The contractor did stop work in April, so what happened was they weren't finding the amount of debris that they thought we were going to find in some of these canals. A lot of the people that live on the canals had removed some of it, and they weren't able to use sonar to go down and dig for it. And so my next slide, I'm going to talk about the NRCS canals. We removed the most heavily impacted ones from their effort, and so the contract said they're not going to work anymore, so now the state DEP is determining how they're going to move forward with the rest of the canals. So some lessons we learned, as I said, the FEMA restrictions. We can't go down to the bottom of the canals. You have to prove that it's from Irma only. We didn't have a canal maintenance program in effect, so we had to use whatever documentation we had on hand from our canal master plan, and good thing we had that. Otherwise, we wouldn't, I don't know if we'd be getting any reimbursement. Was also at the time we started the canal debris removal, we still had some street debris removal going on, so there's very few sites here in the Keys that are big enough to handle debris, and so we had to do it consecutively. While we had the street debris underway, we couldn't even do canal debris removal if we wanted, because there was nowhere to put it. There was low bid pricing, federal funding is slow to arrive, FEMA especially, and I understand a lot of documentation, and then thank goodness our elected officials were helped. They were a very big help, all of them. Go past all this, and so the potential FEMA reimbursements are 10 million. We'll skip all this. They don't cover plug canals either, because it's only for navigability, so all the plug canals that are here, about a dozen, they're not available for reimbursement either. And so debris is going to be left on the bottom if we only go by FEMA reimbursement. And for that reason, we looked for alternate sources of funding, and we went to the United States Department of Agricultural and Natural Resource Conservation Service. We filled out applications for them. Completely different set of circumstances. Their criteria is based on hydraulic capacity. And so if that capacity is impacted, then you have a much better chance of getting funding from NRCS. So back when Hurricane George struck 20 years ago, it was NRCS that came in and cleared out the canals in the Keys at that time. And so there's been no clearing since then. And so we went back to them because they were very helpful the first time. And they do look at other things like economic considerations, like life and property impacts, and things like the debris in canals not causing blockages eligible. But the only thing about this is anything on near shore waters or in the ocean is not eligible. So we'll have to figure out another way to get that. So we applied for all 500, didn't all make it, but we did make 103 were eligible, and those are of course the 103 most impacted. So out of the 103, the estimated cost of those are for debris removal is $45 million, and that comes out of our pocket, and then it's reimbursed from NRCS, and it's a 25% local match, so we're looking at a $10 million local match required. And those are the areas right there, the DSR areas, and we did include the damage, those are damage report areas. And Marathon and Islamorada are also getting funding. We included them under the county's application. So just as a reminder, there's 513 canals impacted, only 103 are covered by the NRCS. So there's still 400 canals out there that need to be cleared, and that's what we're hoping the state effort can continue to help us with that. State schedule for the NRCS work, where RFP is right out on the street today and made it out a couple days ago. We open it in a couple weeks. We hope to be taking both all the contracts for the marine debris removal, the NRCS grant, and the interlocal agreements to our June board and start work there shortly after in July. And it's a very limited 220-day period to spend $45 million, so you know we're going to be busy. Okay, then a little bit background on our canal restoration program. We've been going 5 years. We've had some canal restoration projects. That's because, as you can see here, out of 500 canals, when we did the water quality sampling, there's, and look in that middle orange area, there's 103 in unincorporated Monroe that don't meet state standards. There's another 25 in Islamorada, another 21 in Marathon, for a total of 150. 149 canals that do not meet state water quality standards. So we had to proceed with some canal restoration in order to fend off any regulatory oversight from the state as to not doing anything. So that's why we started the program. I won't get into a whole lot of that here. These are some of the previous projects we already did. We removed 5 feet of organic muck from 2 canals on Big Pine Key, put some air curtains in at the end of those canals to keep out the floating seaweed. These, by the way, were all destroyed in the Hurricane Irma. The air curtains were blown away, some sediment and debris was blown back into the canal, so those are at the top of our list for clearing with the NRCS money. And then we did some more. We'd installed a couple of culverts. Culverts are very cost-effective methods for connecting 2 bodies of water, very cheap. Did another backfill, another very effective source. So it's very expensive to backfill a canal, but it's also very good at the end because then there's no operations and maintenance because there's no air curtains or anything to install. So that's just a real quick summary. This is the only project that's ongoing right now, the restoration project. This is in Key Largo where we're backfilling. Adventure Environmental was selected. That's paid for by a grant from the DEP stewardship allocation. They're under work right now. They've done, it would be wrapped up here in a couple of weeks here, but they've already backfilled 1,200 truckloads, 24,000 tons of fill. And right when we finish that up, we'll be putting on a 6 or 12-inch layer of sand to encourage the seagrass to regrow in there. And the only reason this is the only project we're going on right now, we normally have several, is because of the Hurricane Irma, and we're looking at using our funds for the Irma clearing. And then we have one more quick one, a skimming project. So in Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale do this. They go up and down routinely on the canals and skim off the floating debris and seaweed. And this is really good to prove that you're doing maintenance on your canals, and also to, there's no air curtains to take care of, so it's just a boat that goes in and out the canals. And we're trying that in Key Largo, and if it's successful, we might incorporate into the rest of the keys. But they take the seaweed out to sea that they collect in the canals, and then any debris is there, they take, of course, to the landfill. So we're seeing how well this works. Nearshore water quality monitoring, DEP has partnered with us. They wanted us to do their reasonable assurance document monitoring. We're about to move forward with that. It's $500,000 for 2 years. They're going to be looking at monitoring nearshore waters and canal waters to see how well they're doing. And then that will determine if there's going to be any impacts to us in the future as to additional restoration projects. And so just real quick, lessons learned, we need to have we have to document our yearly maintenance activities to canals in hopes of getting future NRCS or FEMA money. It's much easier when you document your canals, so we're gonna go ahead and propose some type of maintenance program because it's gonna be very useful for FEMA and NRCS. I learned from Miami-Dade that that's what they did too, so they have a routine capacity. Just to end here, so our program funding is not a tidal wave of funding out there. Our estimated funding needs for restoration are $700 million. We're gonna get some restore money in here, $20 million. We get hopefully annual appropriations from the State Stewardship Act and some other acts, but still a long way from what we're gonna be needed, but at least it's a start. And that concludes that presentation. Questions? Let me
Thank
just
you.
questions, or you want me to get into the sea level rise one?
I've got some questions, I'm sure.
Okay.
I've got a question. Yesterday on the drive down, I noticed that along Key State Park, there were mountains on the Gulf side. What is that? Do you know?
Mountain where, on the water?
Yeah, beyond the Gulf side, it looked like in the mangroves, but it was.
I don't know, I was just there, I don't know. Debris?
Could be.
So I don't think the parks that.
It looked fairly uniform, whatever it was. So.
Yeah, I know the parks were heavily hit, all the parks here were heavily hit, and I don't think have totally recovered, and that could have been debris that they're removing and just haven't had a chance to remove yet. Anything else?
Please.
That was very interesting. Thank you for that presentation. On the backfilling of a canal, how much do you put to backfill it? What does it do to the depth?
Oh, so when we have a deep canals in the Keys can go anywhere from 8 feet, which is the optimum depth, down to 40 feet. We have a lot in Key Largo that were dug to 30 and 40 feet deep when the developers were scooping them out to make fill for the houses, which are way too deep. So anything below 8 or 10 feet, you don't get good tidal flushing, and so the bottom just becomes a dead zone. And it actually becomes very deadly because hydrogen sulfide gas builds up on the bottom, and so when we had the divers go in to test the water quality, they had to be really careful not to get into that gassy area. So what we do when we backfill them, the one that we're doing here in Key Largo also, we backfilled the first one from a depth of 30 to 40 feet up to about 8 feet. So that's a lot of truckloads of fill. And then what that does is then it just leaves that top area where you get really good tidal flushing, and then seagrass can start growing on the bottom of the canal after we put the sand layer in, and that's when you see the return of marine life. And so when we did that first one in Key Largo, up by the Winn-Dixie, it was almost immediate return of all types of sea life. We weren't even done a week, and the residents were already emailing us saying that they saw a vast improvement in the amount of fish coming in, and they saw the fish chasing their shrimp going down the canal, and they saw the manatees return. So it was a really big success. And besides the big environmental success, the other good part about the backfilling is that there's no air curtains or operations and maintenance to do it, because these are typically just too deep. It doesn't mean they have a lot of muck in. If they don't have muck in, then they just need backfilling, and you can leave them go. So we don't have for the residents to pay the operations and maintenance costs, which is some of the issues with some of the others.
Backfill with regular road rock and then finish.
Homestead, but we have very strict levels as to what it can be backfilled with, and then we put that top layer of sand on to encourage the seagrass.
Thank
growth.
you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned that you guys are seeking funding for a lot of this.
Yes.
A lot of this remediation you had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like not all of it's guaranteed.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So what are your plans if the funding doesn't come through? Are you gonna have to do an assessment, or are you,
Well-
what are the options there?
So we hopefully, our federal partners, EPA continues to fund at least some of the planning activities, and DEP and continues to fund with their stewardship dollars, but yes, we're gonna be short. So we don't know at this time. What we're really gonna do now is we're actually gonna get a report on our demonstration projects. It's gonna be submitted in March on the effectiveness of the demonstration project. So they've been monitoring the work for the last 3 years. So we need to get that report, and then we need to see how well this, the Hurricane Irma cleaning goes. And then the DEP monitoring that they're gonna do for the next 2 years is gonna tell us a lot more. Whether maybe some of the canals will be taken off the list that are poor or fair. So we really have about a 2-year period left here to go through to get a better grasp on the exact amount of canals that are gonna be restored. But after that, we're still gonna need money. That's a good question.
Right.
It's a very good question. We just did $1 billion sewer installation program here. We couldn't fund it by ourselves. We only have 75,000 residents, and we were very fortunate to have state and federal help for that. So we're hoping for continued help from our state and federal partners, because we just can't do that with our.
I'm sure
local
the hurricane
residents.
strained every single municipality here.
Yes, it did.
Good luck with getting that rectified.
Thank you.
Mhm.
That's really interesting information. I have a couple of questions of my own.
Mhm.
With regards to the funding partners, putting aside the federal government for a second, because honestly, I think, and I'm sure some of my board members here would agree with me, if you've ever navigated the canal, you could understand why their policies and their benchmark, FEMA's policies and benchmarks are just wholly impractical and unwieldy. Anything that's heavier than water will sink. Okay, we'll start off with that concept, and y'all mull that over. More importantly, I am wearing the purple jacket, so I can get away with those things every now and then. More importantly, have you worked with other state agencies, and I'm thinking along the lines of Florida Inland Navigational District, FIND, FWC, anybody else who might have some jurisdictional capacity to assist you with funding or actually running programs to assist you? I'm focusing strictly on the canals and the debris removal and restoration.
So we're in the midst of a national marine sanctuary, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and there is a steering committee here made up of representatives from all the state and federal agencies. And they created, so they meet routinely down here twice a year, and then they created a subcommittee called the Canal Advisory Subcommittee, made up of representatives from some of those agencies who are here, and they've guided us along the way. So we haven't been working with FIND, but we've been working with the rest of them, and so they all do what they can, but EPA, their local funding here is, I think their local region for EPA funding is one of the smallest in the entire country. They only get a couple $1 million a year, so they don't have access to large dollars either. Neither does anybody else. And it became really clear when we went out to search for funding for the canal clearing for Irma, that these agencies don't have funding for that either. I mean, we were just thankful that we ran into NRCS and they were able to help us, because NOAA had no money, very little money. I think they had 18 million to spread over the entire country for their cleanup efforts. 18 million doesn't go far for all the states. EPA had no money. They asked for money, they got none back. So this is the way it's been when we were asking for help just to do the Irma program, much less canal restoration on a normal basis. So no, it's hard to come across.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
My other question is much more related to demographics and indirectly related to sustainability. Do you have any figures on how much of the resident population of the county has been displaced by the storm?
No, if all my other counterparts were here, they would know. I haven't been involved in that effort.
The reason for my
So I
question is
don't know.
obviously, you know, when we're speaking about money, tax roll is top of mind. And I know Melanie's always done a great job with Project and Land and with dealing with surplus, you know, pointing out the fact that we are putting certain properties back onto the tax roll and trying to take a different perspective on where that money will come from. I personally, I'd like to know what the effect has been on the county's ability to generate its own financial resource.
Well, I did know we lost a lot of houses, of course, in the lower Keys. I don't know how many, but I know it was a large amount. And I know that because Irma didn't make landfall here, that we are eligible now for federal funds, like the Community Development Block Grant Fund. I think we've been assigned like $90 million coming from for hazard mitigation funding. So there is on the road coming in, there are going to be funds available to help us with funding, especially they've really targeted in on the funding. And in fact, our commission is having a special commission meeting at 11 o'clock this morning to talk about 1,300 rate of growth permits that the governor assigned us last week to help with affordable housing and after the aftermath of Irma. So it's definitely on everybody's radar.
Okay.
And then they are getting some help for that. The debris efforts it's a much more difficult road.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions regarding this portion of the presentation?
Just real quick, I would also echo reaching out to Vine.
Yes.
I work with them with the Lake Worth Lagoon Initiative, and they've been a great partner, and they have really interesting access to some specific funding grants that if you qualify, there is a pot of money that sits there and doesn't get spent. We've been looking into some of those opportunities for the lagoon, but I would encourage that. It's a little discouraging to hear. I mean, it's great to hear that there's the block grant for rebuilding, but that there's such limited funding for the restorative nature of the canal system. I guess my other question was, you know, when it comes to FEMA funding, especially for an area, you know, this is where it made landfall, a lot of the debris in your canals is homes, people's boats, people's cars, things like that. How does that relate? How are you dealing with, or how do private citizens deal with that with their insurance and their FEMA claims and that sort of thing? I mean, is it just a big mess when you come to trying to decide who's responsible for what and how that works?
Well, from my understanding, insurance doesn't pay to clear anything out of canals. And residents, if we don't do it, it's going to be on their backs. That's why we're trying so hard to make sure that we can do it. And in fact, you know, we have a lot of commercial fishermen down here. They couldn't wait for us to come along and clear the canals because their livelihood was affected. So they did pool their money, and some of the most impacted canals where the commercial fishermen living, they used their own money to clear the canals because they had to get out and earn a living. That was not paid for by insurance. They paid that on their own.
It's incredible.
Because I've talked to many residents, and you know that's why they're all waiting for us, because insurance won't pay for it. Any type of canal.
It's incredible.
It's a big problem. Okay. This is our other opportunity in the Keys, sea level rise. So us being a island community, a lot of our land is at sea level rise or a foot or two above. We're 100 miles, over 100 miles long. We're going to obviously be very susceptible to sea level rise. Just going to quick do today what we are, the areas we are most susceptible in. We've already created a resilience plan. We had to be ahead of the pack. We have to prepare. We can't afford to wait because our roads are already underwater during the fall high tides. Many of our roads, not all of them, but some of them. So I'll talk a little bit about this in the future and later in the thing about what we're doing and some of the areas that are most susceptible. I don't need to tell you where the keys are. You're sitting here. So we only have 77,000 permanent residents. We do get $200 million in sales tax revenue that goes to the state. We have 300 miles of county roads. That does not include US 1, but all the rest of the roads are basically local county roads. And of those 300, half are susceptible to risk of sea level rise by 2030. That's a lot of roads that are going to need elevation. And we're one of the most susceptible areas in the entire nation. Monroe County is third on the list. The population potentially displaced is 36%. That means that's land that's dry now will go underwater by 2060. So the keys will not look the same. They're going to be a little different, but the county has been preparing. We did a sustainability and action plan. We did a lot of vulnerability modeling for all these roads. We had to look at roads. We looked at all our utilities to make sure people can't, even if we elevate the roads, if we don't have utilities here, people can't stay here. So we looked at all these different areas. We want to ensure that people can stay here. We also looked at the environment. And then what we did when we went through this entire plan, we identified the hot spots for road flooding, and then we determined, okay, how do we move forward really quickly? And we determined that we're going to need to do some mobile LiDAR so we know how high these roads are, because our existing LiDAR is aerial flown back from 2008, and that's not accurate enough, because that can be off by up to 6 inches. You can't be off by up to 6 inches when you're planning your road elevation projects. So we paid for it with the mobile LiDAR that we're undergoing right now. So we just continue to do, look at some things. You also want to do make sure you have energy savings and that you're not doing any more greenhouse gas emissions than necessary, because that's what contributes to climate change and that's what contributes to sea level rise. And then, so what we're looking at here, our most vulnerable pieces in the keys are the roads. We're looking at 9 inches of sea level rise in the past 100 years. We're looking at a much more dramatic example. It's now 4 to 7 inches by 2030 and up to 2 feet of water by 2060. Here's a pretty dramatic example. This is Big Pine Key today. And in the best case scenario, by 2060, you can see what happens in the lower keys. Those red areas are inundation. You can see Big Pine Key gets cut in half. There's a lot of outlining areas. That's the best case scenario, if we only get 9 inches. Worst case scenario, we get 24 inches, you can see we lose entire pieces of islands. Very concerning, and we can't stop it, but we can certainly prepare as best we can so that we can stay here as long. So keys are going to be different. We're not going to be able to avoid this, but there are many things we can do, and we want to do some visioning for not just roads elevation, but how the keys should look in the future so that we can prepare to stay here. So we might be the future Venice of America, and a lot of people like that. So we're not giving up here. We're just dealing with different things. These are our county inspectors here looking at the tides in October of 2015 and 2016, where we had up to 16 inches of water on roads for 3 weeks straight. People get a little testy when they have, these are not canals, these are roads. And so we decided to move forward with 2 demonstration projects to elevate our roads, our first ever here in the Keys. You've all been driving around here. Basically, it's just either gravel or blacktop on things. There's not a lot of stormwater treatment area either. So we picked 2 areas, one in Key Largo, one Big Pine Key, to elevate them. We looked at the flooding impacts. We looked at the cost estimates. So everybody asked us, well, how high are you going to elevate the roads? Well, we could do what Miami Beach did. They elevated their roads by, 2 feet or a little bit more right off the bat, and they did them all, and they did it all at once. And we would love to do that, but it's very expensive. We can't afford that down here. So we have to take a more moderate approach. So we can't afford to elevate roads high enough right away so that we never get wet again for the next 50 years. We have to do it piecemeal. And we also have to look at whether there's room enough on the right-of-ways to do these road elevation projects. So we looked at the assessment. We looked at, first of all, what have we seen over the 20 years for tidal records. We looked at then incorporating the sea level rise future projections. Then we developed the scenarios. And finally, we had to look at the neighborhood to see what were the limitations there. And you got a lot of skinny roads in the Keys, especially in these neighborhoods. So there's not a lot of room to elevate the roads. we look forward, and this is, you know, how, skipped a few slides here, but this is how what we're gonna look at. So we're gonna have to treat the stormwater. So when you elevate the road, you have to capture it, you have to move it somewhere. So now you have to build in all the, you know, you guys are the experts. You have to build in the infrastructure to be able to capture it and move it, which means pump stations. And then finally, you have to treat it before you can release it. So now you're looking at a lot of a very expensive road design projects here for the future. So it's not gonna be very simple. You can't build on top of what we already have either, because when those road bases are routinely subject to flooding, if they're not properly built in the first place, they're gonna erode. So any type of road elevation projects we are looking at, we're gonna have to gut the road and start from scratch and put in the new materials so that they'll withstand, for the next 20, 30, 40 years, they'll withstand that flooding that they're gonna see. So road elevation is very costly. Like I said, we looked at elevating them all the way up to 28 inches. It's expensive. When you looked at Key Largo for 28 inches for 1 mile, it was $7 million. Remember, there's 300 miles here. And at the Big Pine Key, they're a little bit lower. When we looked at elevating them for that 1 mile of road, it was $10.5 million for 1.5 miles. So what we decided was we made a standard. We said, okay, we're gonna think for right now, until we get all this better elevation data from the mobile LiDAR, we're gonna set a standard where people don't get wet more than 7 days throughout the year. In order to do that, so Key Largo, then we had to say, okay, we're gonna elevate them 6 inches. And that's gonna be $1 million, and that's only for a quarter of a mile for a very small piece of road. And for Big Pine, we have to elevate it 12 inches because they're much lower. So to get the same level of service, we had to elevate it twice as much, twice as high, and that's 2.6 million. So we're, actually the design is out in the street, and we expect to construct that next fiscal year. We also looked at a bunch of other projects. We have assisted living facilities that are very vulnerable. We have parks that were hit by the storm and are also very vulnerable. So we just conducted a lot of studies, and we're just looking at all these type of things. I won't spend time on this, but you can kind of see here what we're facing here is a lot of different county-owned facilities here that we're looking at. So right now, we're moving forward with the mobile LiDAR. That's underway. We got stopped because of the hurricane. So when you have roads filled with debris, you can't do mobile LiDAR, so we delayed it about 6 months. And right now, they're wrapping that up. And so the next step is to get the data done, and then we're gonna go forward with the countywide inundation analysis of all of our roads, where we're gonna determine for every mile, not only how high it is, but then the expected inundation. And that's gonna help us build our capital plan for road elevation for the next 20, 30 years. And very expensive. So you saw with that $10 million a mile, so when you're looking at 150 roads susceptible to inundation, very expensive work. So again, we're gonna need help paying for that. We're obviously not, we can't do that here, paying it for it by ourselves. We're gonna look to our partners to help us with that. And it's not just a coastal impact, it affects everybody. Water management well knows that. It does go affect inland too, and it's not just coastal roads, and county managers, everybody's gonna have to help us with it. So that's what we're looking at. We have the big canal restoration program, and now we have the roads elevation program.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Mr. Marvin?
Where does your road building material come from? Is it all from Dade County? Or do you know?
For our current maintenance so we don't have so up to this point, we have only road maintenance. We haven't done any road elevation projects yet, but I assume it'll come from Dade County. Some local, but most Dade. Is that it?
Any other questions? Mr. Curcio?
You talked about treatment of water before you can release it, but we're talking about seawater. Or were you talking about rainfall?
Rainfall. Anything that falls on the roads. Remember when we elevate the road, they're gonna be standing up high. So first we have to capture it, because we're not allowed to negatively impact neighbors, the yards. So we have to capture anything that falls on the road, and then take it somewhere, transport it down where we're gonna transport it, and then treat it. So that's what these pilot road projects are designed to do. It's designed to help us figure out where we're gonna do that, if we have enough room for that type of activities here in the Keys. You know, very small streets, very limited right-of-ways, very porous geology. So it's gonna be interesting to see what the, Miami Beach was watching us too, to see what the treatment will be, or treatment
Series I've been working on, and I know Clark's been extensively involved with the topic in Broward County, so I look forward to our future presentations and being able to engage with you folks and provide that feedback and work with each other to address it. I'm from a coastal community, so I definitely sympathize. Thank you again.
You're most welcome, and we'll be reaching out to you when we do our road elevation, maybe perhaps some stormwater funding when we add the stormwater piece in.
There you have it. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe now we are moving on to our Florida Bay update, and Mr. Mitnick and Terry Bates will be assisting us with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We wanted to provide an update since we're here in the Keys. We had a chance to do a presentation back in January for RAC, an update on what we were seeing with Florida Bay conditions. So it's appropriate to share that information here and kind of the current condition of Florida Bay. To start off with aerial imagery, and we think of Florida Bay, this large area, it's about 1,000 square miles, mostly in Everglades National Park. But it's really not just a bay, it's a series of a number of basins. These are shallow water basins separated by mud banks. They can act very differently than each other. Basins right next to each other don't necessarily have tidal interchange. So you can see these mud banks that really isolate different basins within Florida Bay. So it has a very unique ecology. Northeastern Florida Bay is primarily the area that's affected by our operations with the C-111 canal and our efforts to send water down through Taylor Creek. We've got Central Bay, which I'll talk a lot about. That's the focus of the die-off area, Southeast Bay, and Western Florida Bay. So the areas where we monitor each month for flows coming into Florida Bay and are affected by our operations, and where we measure for our minimum flow is here at Taylor River. So let's start back in 1987, which is really what kicked off the majority of the research and science going on in Florida Bay. And it came about because of a previous seagrass die-off of significant magnitude in Florida Bay. You started with a condition of very, very thick, lush seagrass growth, and what's evolved from that science and that die-off is what we call the cascade impact loop, where it's really a cascade domino effect of conditions, starting with the really heavy vegetation of seagrass growth and ending up when you've got periods of low rainfall and low flows into the bay. You end up with elevated salinities, high temperatures, and that can trigger seagrass die-off. So now you have thousands of acres of dead seagrass occurring. As that dead material starts to decompose, it's using up oxygen in the water, and it ends up with a kind of a toxic sulfide condition. You get this yellow fog in the water that triggers more seagrass die-off. You have more material dying, more material decomposing, less oxygen. The release of all that nutrients from the decomposing material then is triggering algal bloom conditions. Now you've effectuated light penetration for the remaining seagrass. You're not getting the light through these thick algal blooms. So it's just this cascade of impacts that occurs over time, and that's very much what we saw occur with the event in 2015. The circumstances that really set up the seagrass die-off that we're dealing with now started May 2014 through 2015, really an 18-month period of well below normal rainfall. And if you looked at the district as a whole, we didn't see that up here in West Palm Beach and other part of the district. We were pretty much normal rainfall. But if you look at the area directly in Florida Bay and South Dade, very, very low rainfall conditions, well below average, 25 to 45 inches of rain over an 18-month time period. So significant rainfall deficit, and not just from flows coming through the system, but from direct rainfall. About 46% of the water budget for Florida Bay comes from direct rainfall over the bay itself. So we saw with these very, very low flow conditions, we end up with hypersalinity occurring across the bay. And they correspond very well with the flows coming in. The freshwater discharge to Florida Bay, that what we would consider to be a typical or average based on the median, is this black dashed line. And just to give you a sense, that's what we saw in water year 15 and 16, substantial below normal rainfall conditions within the bay. And we came out of that with those abnormally wet conditions that we experienced with heavy discharges from Lake Okeechobee to the estuaries and well above normal rainfall in water year 16, and then again after Hurricane Irma. So the conditions that set up in the bay as a result of that lack of rainfall were hypersalinity conditions. And so to give you a comparison, here on the left is from 2013, what we would consider kind of normal wet season conditions, where up along the nearshore area, where you've got freshwater flows coming into the bay, it's much less saline, and then you get out to kind of a transition zone of a little bit saltier water and then more marine conditions. Well, what we saw in 2015 at the start of the die-off, you can see this very purple color, really almost off the chart as far as salinity. So really high levels of salinity, 50 and above, in the central, especially in the central portion of Florida Bay. But the bay overall, the entire bay was hypersaline. So for the last 14 years, dashed here in the middle, the green line is what we saw as actual condition. So again, low rainfall, low freshwater inputs, hypersalinity, and that triggered the seagrass die-off in July of 2015. So you look at the bay itself, might look, everything seems to be beautiful that day out on the bay, but you go subsurface, and this is what the scientists were reporting, just thousands and thousands of acres of dead turtle grass across the bay. So as that material, again, is decomposing, it's using up oxygen, it's releasing nutrients, it's triggering algal blooms, and limiting light penetration into the communities. The bay, again, 1,000 square miles, we certainly are not the only folks working out there. We work in partnership with Everglades National Park and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. Dr. Penny Hall, she presented this information at RAC in January. The commission has been doing seagrass monitoring on the bay since I think 1995. And so the areas that were documented as the most significant area of seagrass loss are over here in central Florida Bay. The red area is substantially impacted on the order of 25,000 to 30,000 acres, and an overall area affected well above 45,000 acres across the bay. So this is the monitoring program that's been in effect from the commission, again, going back to 1995. So each one of these kind of little honeycomb areas is one of the monitoring locations that they go to measure the density and species of seagrass in the bay. And just to back up, the area I'm going to show you is up in this area of Rankin Bay and Whipray Basin. So this is data from the commission looking at spring 2015 before the die-off started, and then those same areas progressing through spring of 2017. So starting with Thalassia, again, very, very dense coverage here, and as you go over time, we started to see that significant seagrass die-off. Actually, we're starting to see some recovery by spring of 2017. Haliduli, not as much that existed before, but we were starting to see recruitment coming in those areas that had been denuded, started to have some colonization as we were starting to see recovery of conditions across the bay. So what that does, not just the seagrass die-off, is also the effect on water quality. So this graphic showing you the A and phosphorus decomposing, causing algal bloom. The data shows the period of record of what you would kind of expect seasonally, and here the dots are the actual data. So within about 6 months of the seagrass die-off occurring, we started to see very elevated chlorophyll A conditions. Again, those are the things that are an indication of algal blooms across the bay. And similarly, high levels of phosphorus being released as that material has been decomposing. So we saw these pretty significant spikes that occurred 6 months to a year after the seagrass die-off, but we were starting to see recovery occur in early 2017, at least conditions are more favorable throughout the bay. Hurricane Irma kind of put everything in a reset mode as it came pretty much directly across this area. And the graph here on the right is the stage condition. And as typical with a hurricane, as it approaches, you kind of have all the water being drawn out of the system. So you had significant movement of water out of the bay. And we actually had pictures across Key Largo where it was just no water at all. There were stranded manatees that were photographed. And then as the hurricane passes through, a significant rush in with that storm surge. So that serves to stir up all that material in the bay, just as it did along the coastline. So about a 6 foot storm surge. Saw that material resuspended across the bay. There were large racks of dead material that had been resuspended, tearing up of some new seagrass material as well. But as we got to do the monitoring in post-hurricane, we didn't see wide-scale destruction. It was really more stirring up the material that had already died, because the levels that we had seen in spring of 2017, we did have some additional impact, but not widespread destruction as a result of the hurricane. So it's been a setback, but we're still looking for that continued recovery. One of the questions we got a lot from residents in Key Largo area is, what about the water? It looks so cloudy. It's this milky white. When is that going to go away, especially right after the hurricane? And we certainly saw from the satellite imagery, you can see with all the water coming into the bay and everything being stirred up, this cloudy condition, especially up here on the northeastern Florida Bay. And that's a measure of turbidity in the waters. Everything, all the sediments got stirred up. Here's the, again, period record of what you would expect to have seen as far as turbidity. And then after Hurricane Irma, very, very high conditions of turbidity, again, which limits the light penetration into the system. But starting to see those levels start to slowly improve over time. The salinity conditions due to Hurricane Irma, we actually were getting to kind of dry conditions heading into the storm. So you can see the purple colors, appropriate for today, purple. But that's an indication of higher levels of salinity. Right after the hurricane, you can see fresh water, significant amount of fresh water coming in along the nearshore area, so that really turned to a fresher water condition. And this is from February of 2018 back to what we consider a more normal salinity across the majority of the day. From an algal bloom condition, again, the algal bloom that kind of settled down, here's the scale on the bottom. The 0 to 1 is an indication very, very low levels of chlorophyll A. So we really had not seen significant persistence of algal blooms across the bay. After the hurricane and all that material being stirred up again, we certainly were seeing algal blooms spread from the western bay all the way over to northeastern Florida Bay. And here we are 5 months. This data was from 5 months post-hurricane. Again, pretty much recovered in northeastern Florida Bay, but still seeing some algal bloom conditions in the central part of the bay. So to give you a comparison of the data, here again where we were from the die-off in water 16, the spike that I showed you earlier, and then here's Hurricane Irma. So where we had started to see pretty good recovery in water quality, both from the chlorophyll A and the phosphorus level, nutrient levels, they once again were spiked up as a result of turning over all that material in the sediments, and actually recorded the highest levels of chlorophyll A that we've seen in Florida Bay. Phosphorus levels were elevated. We're starting to see that trend come down. This data goes through April, so we're continuing to monitor that improvement in water quality condition. And this is just a cycle we're going to have to go through in the bay to get back to recovery of the system. So the question a lot of folks have asked, well, are we on that recovery? Are we out of the woods yet? And one of the things that the hurricane tended to do is take a lot of that material deposited on the shoreline. We've got rack area of debris and detritus that's going to continue to break down and be releasing nutrients into the system. I know Mr. Accurso shared his observations being down near Flamingo of a lot of mangrove areas that were impacted. And this is data that comes from NASA, that it released one of its aerial satellite imagery showing impacts. The green are what they've identified as recovering mangroves, and the orange and the darker red as more severely impacted. Their estimate as they did the map over 10,000 island area was about 60% of the mangrove areas were significantly damaged. And so that's a concern, because as we're looking for improved water conditions, one of the things that's different here than the event in 1987, 1987 wasn't followed by a hurricane that then added a whole new amount of material into the system. And as a result of the mangroves dying off now because of hurricane impacts, that's going to be a new influx of nutrients and detritus into the system. So we're not sure how that's going to affect our progression and recovery. This is an image from NASA from March 28, 2017. And then this is the image from December of 2017. So we don't know yet, are the trees dead? Are they just been defoliated and have lost all of their leaves? Are they going to be coming back? That's something we're going to continue to monitor with the other agencies that work across Florida Bay. But certainly something that's a different condition than what we saw at the event in 1987. I'll leave you on a positive note, even though these areas have been impacted, along with the rest of the Everglades, record-setting wading bird nesting. This is the Broad River wading bird nesting colony, which last year had about 758 nests, about 500 wood storks, 200 great egrets, kind of a small colony. This year there's 7,000 nests, 800 wood storks, 200 egrets, and the big difference are the white ibis nesting anywhere they can find. There's about 6,000 ibis nests here. There were 0 last year. So we're watching these colonies as well. So the summary, just as we learned from the previous event, you're going to see these cycles of nutrients being released as that material starts to decompose. That's leading to algal bloom conditions that at least we were seeing in Florida Bay. Those conditions dissipated after a few months, and we were starting to see that recovery. So we thought things were certainly positive for the Bay. But then following Hurricane Irma, highest chlorophyll A levels we've seen algal bloom conditions because of the hurricane. But again, we're starting to see those levels start to improve, so we're optimistic about that. It certainly is something that's going to take a long time to recover in this system, but we're seeing positive signs. The unknown here is the impact of those mangrove losses that we saw as a result of the hurricane. So with that, I would just say stay tuned. I recognize our staff and commission staff that have been working on this and pulled the data together. They're out there, when they go for monitoring, they're out there for a week in very, very remote locations to collect this data once a month, so we're monitoring progression across the system. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So it looks like conditions are improving. You're seeing lower salinity levels, lower phosphorus levels, higher chlorophyll levels. What is the process of trying to bring that seagrass back? Is there a potential to seed seagrass? Explain that process.
Yeah, there's really not the vastness of the area that we're talking about, but you have kind of a centralized area of impact, but you have areas surrounding that are certainly there as that seed source. As the water quality conditions improve and you get the light penetration, there's a seed source there for that recovery. And I should mention, just I'll kick off to John in a minute, one of the other significant efforts that came because of the die-off that we saw was the district's efforts to be able to bring more water into Florida Bay. And that's what John's going to cover, because the areas that we can most directly affect with freshwater inflows is in northeastern Florida Bay through Taylor River. And so that's where we've taken action to try and help improve those conditions.
So if you see those conditions continue to improve, that seagrass potentially could come back on its own with the material that's there.
Yeah, and it will take time, and what we're seeing is an evolution of you have kind of early recruitment species coming in, a little bit different species of seagrass, and that's going to help stabilize the sediments, because that's the other impact is you've lost all the vegetation. You have very loose sediments that can easily get stirred up, but we're starting to see recruitment of other species come in. But again, it took a very, very long time after the last die-off to fully get the bay back to those conditions.
Well, it's refreshing to see the birds start to come back, and that is a good thing. Thank you, Terry.
Terry, the wood stork increases tenfold after a major weather event. Is there any correlation as to, from the weather event to this major increase in estimate?
Yeah, I won't say it was tenfold at that location. It went from about 500 to 800 at that particular location, but just really throughout the system. And we would tie that back to the very, very wet conditions we were in 16 and 17, where we had all the Everglades. Now we've set up with just kind of those perfect recession of water levels that are the cues for those wading birds to nest, and they started very early. So it's, you know, it's kind of the cycle of nature. You've got a really bad event, then you've got this tremendous rainfall that's triggering great nesting success throughout the system.
I actually have another question regarding the mangroves. Comparing our mangrove communities, do we have any parallels that we can draw historically with other storms that were maybe not as big but had stronger wind events like Andrew or whatnot, to kind of gauge recovery in time periods and time allotment for that?
I'm sure that we do. I can't give you an answer to that off the top of my head.
Okay,
It's something I can certainly bring back and share with the board.
I'd be interested.
I know that there's areas where not from storm damage, but from freeze damage,
Right.
and it's taken several years before you get that regrowth back. You know, the concern here on the mangrove damage is if the trees have died, what that happens with the sediments and kind of the stability of the soils in those areas.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Sure. Sam?
In the area, talking about the mangroves, there is some close to Flamingo, there is no green growth whatsoever on these trees. They look dead. On the water flow coming in through Taylor Slough, that mainly affects the northeast area, doesn't it?
Yeah, over northeast over this, let me get that slide back up.
I think it was like your first one. And the western portion is over in Rabbit Key. That is strictly rainfall, isn't it? To get the fresh water to that area. And when the seagrass dies, it's not gonna move because of the mud banks. Is that our problem, that it's not pushing out into the Gulf and getting out of there?
You have those isolated banks, so you have that material kind of staying within that particular area. And you're correct, that most of the area where we're affecting flows are coming through these 5 major inflows, coming through Taylor River and from the C-111 project. When you get over into really the western banks, there's not a lot of freshwater inflows coming into that area. So they're susceptible to high salinity. If they don't have a lot of rainfall, you get evaporation, and you end up with higher salinities in there as well.
Because my whole lifetime, prior to right now, storms were good for the bay. That's what I've always been told, but in this case, it seems like it set us back months, maybe a year and a half for recovery efforts. Is that true?
Yeah, it was widespread across this entire region, and so it certainly did set us back. But we're seeing that area start to recover as we had good rainfall event coming into the system.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Thank you, Terry. Mr. Minnick, thank you.
All right, so as Terry said, I'm gonna provide the board a brief update on the Board of Bay project that you approved some months ago, if not almost more than a year ago. Just to refresh your memory, the neck of the woods that we're talking about over here on the left-hand side, southern or western Miami-Dade County, the 8.5 square mile area, or the West Palms community, coming down into the northern detention areas, the southern detention areas,
Because
all
when
the
Keith
way
called
down
me, he said he
here
could actually see
to
things that were going on for the
3G
first time.
detention area, and of course, Taylor Slough coming out there. So I'll draw your attention over to the left, or I'm sorry, the right-hand side of the graphic, just what the construction features consisted of that we have been implementing for the last several months, if not the better part of a year now. The first one was to construct this location right in here to connect the flowway that comes from the Frog Pond detention area over to this canal here, the L31 West Canal. We had also received approval to operate this structure up here, the 328 structure, to be able to move water from this detention area into, again, the L31 West Canal here. In addition to that, all these little red dots that you see along the canal running down to here are plugs that were constructed and installed to plug the canal. So as to prevent water leaving the marsh area, moving directly into the canal and short-circuiting down the canal. So we just installed 10 different plugs along the length of the canal. In addition to that, up here around the 332D pump station, the discharge basin of that pump station had a lot of seepage. So as you would be pumping, so you turned off those pumps, all of that seepage would immediately just move into the groundwater and circulate back to the east into the canal system. So we had a construction effort to go in there and actually pour concrete in the bottom of that discharge basin to seal it up and try to get that water, instead of just going around and around in circles right there, but push it farther out to the west out this way. Also, once you got farther out to the west, there was a weir that extended all the way across the top of the detention cell here. We degraded a portion of that weir to allow more water to move down towards the south into the detention basin. And of course, lastly, we had vegetation maintenance that has been performed in the Frog Pond detention areas. So all of those items, you can see them there with the check marks, all of those have been completed and have been pressed into service over the last several months. The two remaining items of the overall project that have yet to be completed are the last two on this list that are highlighted in bold. And that consists of rebuilding a levee or a weir. There had been a gap as this levee had come down from the north. There was a gap right in here that allowed water to freely exchange from the marsh into the detention cells and from the detention cells back into the marsh right in that area. So as part of the project, we are reconstituting a weir and a levee right along that area. It's actually an adjustable weir that we have boards in that we can remove and account for the amount of water that you want to move out of those detention cells. So actually that portion or that construction feature will probably be completed later this month. They're just wrapping up that construction effort. And the last component of it to be completed later this summer is installing increased pumping capacity, a new pump into the S200 pump station located here and the S199 pump station located right here. So as Terry was describing, those were all the construction features associated with the Florida Bay project as approved by the board. You can see from Terry's presentation the different creek flow gauges that she had discussed, as well as the salinity gauge down there at the bottom of Taylor River. What I'll fast forward to now is an aerial photo that we had taken on a flight. The mayor earlier came down to talk with them and meet some of the county officials back in the beginning of April. This is the actual picture that was taken right around that same time. What you see off in the background here, this is actually the 332D detention area here. This is Upper Taylor Slough winding down, coming underneath the Park Road and the Park Bridge. This is, as we were going about constructing the Florida Bay project, we were continuing to operate it while the contractor was trying to build it. So we coordinated with the contractor, specifically when I talk about the sealing of that detention basin right behind the pump station. He would work 8 hours during the day and then get everybody out of the hole, and we'd turn on the pump at night and move water. So we started doing that sometime back in September of last year. So between September of last year to roughly the beginning of April, end of March, we were able to maintain those operations with all the excessive water that's been in the system that we've all heard about from the wet season. So we've been able to move approximately about 17.5 billion gallons of water to the headwaters of Taylor Slough. And what you kind of see in this picture here has the marsh and the rest of the basin to the slough dried out and are brown. You can see the nice green vegetation that is indicative of the slough itself. And I'll just jump to the last slide. It's a little bit farther on down to the south, looking back to the north. Again, the Park Bridge is there, the main entrance road to the park, and you can see how the green vegetation continues to extend down further in the slough. That's indicative of the slough continuing to get that water and continuing to stay hydrated longer and longer into. So with that, that's pretty much the update that I have, unless you have any questions.
Do you have any questions or comments? Sam?
John, is there any talk, the project seems to be working well, you have some evidence there, but from our federal partners to continue this in a curtain wall to keep that water from recirculating back to the east and protect the metro areas and agricultural areas while keeping the park in that area hydrated.
Yeah, I think there's been a fair amount of discussion recently on continuing a cutoff wall further to the south, up and down the C-111 up. I can tell you that Keenan and I have had several conversations as of late how to advance that effort and get some analysis going and put together some documentation to present and start conversations with the board on what something like that would look like. Yes. Thank you.
Just to add some detail, maybe Ernie wants to chime in on this. I know that with our delegation, our Florida delegation, we spoke extensively about seepage control, curtain walls, and similar structure to assist us with basically buttressing the efforts that Mr. Mitnick has identified and as a flood control measure. Ernie, you want to add to?
I think John pretty much touched on it, that we've discussed, and obviously our legislative delegation for the state, or at least the southern part of the state, we've talked to them about the need to address seepage as well as being able to maintain operation in a particular area, because we have a balance. Like John said, I have impressed upon John and his folks that we need to start looking at this in more detail. I know it was originally discussed back when we were doing the South Dade study, and but I wanted to make sure that we were making some effort to move that forward in the near term instead of waiting for something as part of COP or something along those lines. So we've got folks working internally so that we can start socializing that with the board and getting their input.
Thank you both very much. Any other questions for Mr. Mitnick? Okay, thank you. Moving on to item number 37 regarding the emergency action by the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Last month, it was discussed with the board some emergency actions they took on the L-59 canal. Since that time, all board members have had a chance to gather some additional facts from staff and read over our responsibilities as the district's board in the tribal compact agreed upon by both parties many years ago. I'd like to hear board member thoughts on what action should be taken by the district as action before we have from the district's
location that we're talking about within the district. It is to the northwest of Lake and South Lake, as defined as the Indian Prairie. By the east to the Kissimmee River C-38. And the Seminole Tribe has its Brighton Reservation here that is in orange. So one of the questions the board asked last month were, who were the people in the basin? And these are properties that touch the coloring of the projects. Purple means that they use both surface water and groundwater for that project, and yellow means that they solely rely on surface water. And so, yes, there are a lot of entities that L-59 Barrow Canal, but only these projects here are defined as existing legal users in Barrow Canal. Existing legal users means that they have a water use permit from the Water Management District to withdraw water from the L-59 Barrow Canal specifically. And so let me give you a little bit more detail about the features of the canal. Again, this is the L-59 bypass. It's operated by bringing water into the canal would flow all the way up to these double culverts, which are permitted through our right-of-way program to PV Ranch. And as a result of by the tribe, they installed a plug, and the plug is located here, and it's an earthen plug. One of the other questions that was asked by, and so is where the district is holds an easement from the tribe for this property, and the yellow, which generally follows the south side of the canal, and includes the actual yellow is what we see. And during one of the public comments last month's board meeting was a statement that the district had itself installed a plug in the L59 Borough Canal the years 83, 86, 90, 91, 93, saying that these double culverts needed to be maintained in good repair. But that didn't really happen by the permittee. And so the district needed to do some maintenance of the L59 Borough Canal. And because we needed to be having heavy equipment traverse both sides of the canal, and because we were concerned that the heavy equipment wouldn't be safe being crossed on the double culverts, the district itself went in and installed a culvert crossing. And that was done at this location where we have historic crossing. And so what it was a culvert with an open connection so water could flow freely on both sides, and the district used it to cross its heavy equipment back and forth on both sides of the L59. And when the district was finished with its project, the district removed that culvert crossing. So turning back to the emergency action, you saw this picture last month. It is a picture of what the earthen plug actually looks like. And again, here is where it's located in the basin. So there are two things that are governing the tribes and districts' interaction on this particular issue. I mentioned them last week, but I'll go ahead and go over them now. We have a right-of-way memorandum of understanding that governs how the tribe requests use of the district's right-of-way. And that MOU requires prior authorization before they start construction activities. One of the district believes that the activity exposes the district to unusual risk or liability, we could require insurance. The tribe agreed to comply with the substantive portions of our right-of-way rules and criteria. And the district agreed that we would consider requests that are inconsistent with the right-of-way rules and criteria, if the tribe could show that it didn't interfere with the district's responsibilities for construction, operation, and maintenance of that right-of-way. And that was our primary focus. So, also what governs our interaction on this issue is the water rights compact between the district and the tribe in the state of Florida. There is a provision for dealing with emergencies in the compact. The tribe is allowed to take emergency actions to address serious and unforeseen or unforeseeable events. It requires them to make a report to the governing board at the first board following the emergency, and that is what happened last month. The report is supposed to say the actions that they took and how they propose to conform their actions to the right-of-way compact, the right-of-way criteria, the compact, the criteria manual, and any work plans. And then at the next governing board, which is this governing board, the district may require the tribe to conform their emergency actions. If we don't ask them to take any conforming actions, we are deemed to have accepted what they have done. And then the tribe has 60 days to notify the district if they'll comply in full, comply in part, or refuse to comply with the district's request. And if we receive a refusal or a compliance in part, then the district has 45 days to file in federal court seeking redress. So the tribe submitted the right-of-way application and emergency actions request, again, to install an earthen plug into its right-of-way. And then the submittal stated that the plug would remain there until the district installed a water control structure or took over PV Ranch's double culverts. We also received a work plan amendment with this, essentially the same information that was submitted through the right-of-way application and emergency action. And we are going to be handling that process in the process that's set forth in the compact. So right now before you, all of that you have to address is the right-of-way application, and those documents were submitted to district staff, and district staff put together a staff report as is normal procedure when information comes in from the tribe. And after they analyzed the submittals, the district staff had these following concerns. One, earthen plugs are prohibited by our right-of-way criteria, and there weren't any proposals to conform to the right-of-way, some unique circumstances that might justify it being there. District staff had concerns that it would interfere with our operation and maintenance of the L59 borough now because it prevents water from flowing back and forth, which is a flood control issue. And there needs to be a better response time in responding to potential flood control concerns. And because of that, it represented an increased liability to the district. And also the fact that it was an earthen plug and no way to have water flow back and forth, they viewed it as inconsistent with the policy and objectives of Chapter 373 because it may interfere with an existing legal user's split system. And so all of that was contained in the staff report and it was submitted to the board. And so what district staff is presently seeking from the board is an order requiring the tribe to remove the earthen plug to conform its actions to the compact. But we're also seeking authorization to grant the tribe the ability to install an appropriate water control structure consistent with the recommendations in the staff report. And so some of those recommendations are here for you so that you have a feeling for what they are. The structure needs to be able to pass 100 cubic feet per second of water with a maximum head loss of 0.1 foot. They need to provide us with an operational plan with a response time for transitioning between hours. Also to provide the district with insurance, but the amount of insurance will depend on the type of structure that they propose to install. And so staff, again, is recommending the board issue an order requiring the tribe to conduct these actions. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or see if appropriate staff is available.
Ms. Moran.
Thank you. So what will it take for the conform the earthen plug to our right-of-way criteria? Do they have to totally remove it?
We aren't dictating exactly what the tribe needs to do. There are various to them. One could be straight out removal of the earthen plug. Another could be to convert it to a culvert crossing, which would be consistent with district criteria. There's criteria on what a culvert crossing needs to look like with risers or boards. Or they can, construct something totally new. So we're giving them the flexibility to submit what would be appropriate for their needs, and we'll be waiting on that submittal.
Okay, thank you.
Just to be clear though, what you're, based on the recommendations of staff, what we're talking about here is considering the approval of an order that would firstly require the removal of the earthen plug, and then the second phase would be to authorize the tribe to install an appropriate water control structure.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Whitten.
The water supply mitigation plan that the tribe will need to come up with once they install this water control structure will it specific amount, will they be required to provide the same amount of water to the Twin Sisters Ranch that we have committed to them?
Well, Twin Sisters has a permit, a water use permit issued from the district with a certain volume that is to meet their demand. There's a max month and an annual, that's tied to what the crop type is on Twin Sisters. And so I think in developing the water supply mitigation plan, we should probably have conversations about what's the actual need that needs to go into there, because we realize that there is direct rainfall. There is seepage from the lands into the canal, so it's a potential, depending on the time of the year, that you might not have to actually flow the entire volume stated in the water use permit. It could be something different, but I think a conversation needs to be had and some sort of analysis needs to be done.
And put some volume requirements on that and some.
We can,
Yeah.
or stage levels. I think we should probably sit down with the tribe and have further discussions about that. We can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Melanie?
That would be dependent on if they decide to install something,
Correct.
just to be clear. Because it's an option, it's
Correct.
not. So
We
if
are
they
not
des-
mandating that a structure go in. It is an option available to the tribe.
So dependent on what structure, if they install one, then we would have that conversation and be involved.
Do we have any other questions, comments from the board? Mr. Curcio?
We are fast approaching the wet season. So we're talking about, there's a long time frame that you had mentioned. What's gonna happen if this stretches out and we do get into a flooding situation in that area? How many users or pastures are at risk in that area of flooding? I know last meeting, it was said that they can remove it in a half a day, which isn't a lot of time, but they're cooperative and reacting.
The tribe is continuing to represent that they, if it starts raining tomorrow and there's an emergency situation, they can remove the plug within 4 to 8 hours. So that's been a commitment to them in all of the submittals and all the conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jennifer, also their alternative, I believe it says that if they built a different structure, that they would transition in about 2-hour period of time.
Yes, sir, and that 2-hour period of time is actually the district's response time, because it manually operates G34, which is at the east end here. So we're asking that they have the same response time as we do when we respond to flood control issues.
And just so the full board understands, my understanding is that those double culverts up there that currently have no boards in them, and that's a whole nother topic.
Correct.
But if there were boards in those double culverts, this would be a moot point.
Yes. And we are hopeful that we can continue to work on a long-term situation, a long-term resolution with all of the stakeholders out there.
And is there still ongoing litigation with those double culverts, is that correct?
Yes, sir, there is.
Any further questions or comments? Tia, do we have any public comment? Thank you. Well, all right, seeing as we have no other public comment, I'd like to then ask for a motion from the board to approve the order as recommended by the stated outline here, the specific language provided by staff. We have a motion. Second. All in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Motion approved. Orders approved. All right, moving on to item number 38. I'd like to call Francois LaRoche, the Section Administrator for Vegetation Management, to discuss the area application services for vegetation management activities.
Yes,
Good
good
afternoon.
morning. I'll be giving you a brief overview of our area application services, and there will be a resolution for your approval. Vegetation management is part of invasive nuisance terrestrial and aquatic vegetation within district canals, lakes, and right-of-way. The CNFS project, in other words, of the district, to ensure conveyance capacity within canals and water bodies, and continuous controls of invasive plants and district land. Maintenance is accomplished primarily through contracted herbicide applications, both by ground application and by aerial application. Aerial application is one of our tool in our toolbox that we use mostly for inaccessible weed infestations, and also to conduct large-scale herbicide applications. To give you an example, an airboat and a crew can treat about 4 acres in a day. Our aerial application can treat about 250 to 300 acres in a day. We also use aerial application to transport crews, materials, and supplies, to transplant emergent and submergent vegetation and RSTAs, and also to conduct inspection and surveys of invasive species. Just to give you a little bit of background, at the district, we use mostly helicopters to do service. Although it's a smaller payload, but because of the areas that we work in, low herbicide drift potential is an issue for us. It provides greater maneuverability. It also, we can do remote landing, also precise applications, and we also require external load operation in some instances, and also we do inspection and mapping, compared to the airplanes, where it's a greater risk for the type of work that we're doing, and also there are some herbicides that are not labeled for use with airplanes. Just to give you a little background on how this works, there is a bash truck as support equipment to the helicopter. The helicopter lands on the bash truck. The bash truck is usually configured so it allows us to use different materials at a time. And sometimes when we're using granular application, the bash truck has a crane that can lift up to 1,000-pound bags to put on the hopper for the helicopter to strip. The helicopter for liquid application is, there's a spray boom that is about 35 foot under the helicopter, and the boom is designed for controlled droplet depending on the type of application that we're doing, and so the droplet you don't have drift. And also there is an onboard computer system that meters the liquid as the helicopter flies to adjust it to the speed of the helicopter. And we also, in the bottom slide, you can see we have different nozzle configuration depending on the plants we are treating. Over the years, we've spent a lot of time studying with the help of the University of Florida on the different type of application with the different spray pattern that we have. As you know, South Florida has got a lot of different exotics that we have to deal with, and they all do respond differently for different herbicide and different application methods. This is an example back when we were trying to figure out how to kill Melaleuca. On the right, the blue area shows an area application that we're going to treat Melaleuca. The Melaleuca stayed green, and the sawgrass that we were not targeting died, compared to the area on the red where it was a proper application with the proper nozzle, where Melaleuca died and there was no non-target damage. The helicopter is also equipped with a precision navigation system, and it's spray on, spray off. The red area shows in this map shows you where the material was sprayed. Dark line is when the spray was off and the helicopter was ferrying around to load and get more herbicide. So we can do very precise applications and know exactly where to place the herbicide. These are some pictures of example of air applications. Top left, torpedo grass treatment in Lake Okeechobee. Top right, cattail treatment in Lake Okeechobee. And bottom left is the vegetation strip and the STAs, where we allow the cell to grow in cattail, and then we come in and treat to allow submerged vegetation. So we have veg strip and the cells on the right is the drill treatment in Lake Kissimmee. Again, more Lusiola treatment in Lake Okeechobee. We have a task of Lygolium treatment in the refuge, and we're going to be doing a lot of that with this contract, and we also used it for Melaleuca control in the refuge. And as you can see in the bottom picture, it's very precise, where we only kill what we intend to, very little non-target damage. As we are getting some areas in the maintenance control, like the water conservation areas, we're moving to what we're calling aerial spot treatment, where it's a spray system that is hooked under the helicopter that allows us to go in and treat 1 or 2 trees at a time in a long distance, compared to having an airboat going to conservation areas, spend 20, 30 miles looking for 2 or 3 trees. With the helicopter, it takes minutes. You go out, spray the tree, and then with minimal non-target damage. We don't just kill things with the application. We also do submerged vegetation drops to help in the STAs where we are trying to increase submerged addition, and on the right, the picture shows where we are sowing seeds from the helicopter and A1FEB. Sorry. So, in conclusion, aerial application services provide application of herbicides for aquatic, terrestrial, and spot spraying applications, and we also use it to transmit native vegetation in the STAs and also flight mapping and survey of invasive species. Some of the certification requires for aerial application contracts, those of FAA regulation, Part 137 is for agricultural operation to allow the helicopter to dispense chemicals. Part 135 is for transport of passengers, and Part 133 is for external load for hanging a load under the helicopter. They also have to be certified by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services for aerial certification to apply herbicide, and they also have to have a CDL license for the ground support equipment with hazardous material endorsement. This is just to give you a brief overview of the past 10 years, what we've spent in our aerial contract services. As you can see, the last 5 years, we've done less aerial application, about less than $2 million a year. This is because not only we're getting maintenance control in the water conservation areas where we used to do a lot of canality treatment, we're also doing less treatment in the Kissimmee-Channel Lakes, and now we're going to be concentrating more in the Lac Satch Refuge and the Kissimmee River, where we have large infestation of Niglodia and Mahaluka. So with that, I would recommend approval for the resolution to enter into a contract with Coastal Air Services for aerial spraying, aerial granular application, and with helicopter applicators for aerial spot treatment. Any questions? Thank you.
Board questions or comments? Mr. Moran?
Thank you, Francois. How effective is the aerial treatment vis-a-vis, I've been out in the refuge in airboats and saw the crews working there on the ground. Tough work. I mean, they're up to their knees or more in water, chopping away at the Mahalukas, and then I guess they put some kind of treatment on the stumps or whatever they do. So, I mean, how effective is aerial treatment vis-a-vis treatment for the crews who work on the ground?
Yeah, aerial treatment can be very effective. The problem, though, is the non-target damage. So crews on the ground target areas where it's not densely infested. So they go to single trees, clump of trees. As compared to aerial treatment, you have to have a large area where you're not concerned with non-target damage. So that's why we use aerial application. So if you were sending an airboat to treat those large acreage, it'll take you a lot of money and a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
Aerial application, it's less expensive and also is done very quickly.
Speaking of a lot of money, we had complained, I had complained during the time we were trying to renegotiate the license agreement that the feds needed to come up with like $5 million more a year in order to do adequate treatment. Now we've taken over that responsibility. Are we having any luck getting funding for that?
So, as board members may recall, when we did the license agreement, one of the things that we negotiated with the service was to ensure that the amount of money that they were spending on this continued to come, that it would come to the district. So we have that money, we have some internal funds in the vegetation management group. We would look to put some of those funds there, but we also have some restricted funds from lands that we own that had DOI encumbrances on it. And those funds, which have been sitting in a fund because they've had really, there's only been a couple of items based on the language that was in those encumbrances as to what we could use that for. We have been working with DOI to free up those funds to use it here in this particular application as well. So we've got a pretty good, my hope is we continue to have a pretty good funding stream, at least for the next couple of years. I think when we first talked about this, we were talking about $5 million a year in order to get it under control, and then a maintenance amount after that. So we'll continue to work. I know.
And if I may add, we also working with FWC, which has provided money in the past, and if I will
most likely continue to provide some funding for that project.
Was it, long-term, was there any chance we could apply? I know everybody applies for Amendment 1 money, but this would certainly seem to be one of the uses that Amendment 1 money was intended to be used for.
Joe will ask you that I asked his folks to be vigilant about looking for sources of funding, not just for vegetation management, but also for prescribed burns. I mean, we just recently got something from the Department of Forestry saying that they had money for those kind of activities, burns in particular. I've got Joel's folks working on that, but these as well. Any opportunities that we have out there for a source of funds, we're going to continue to look for.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to item 39, general public comment. I'd like to ask at this point in time if we have any general public comment. Tia?
Yes, sir, I have 3. I have Elizabeth Jolin, Kara Cat, and Celeste Pond.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Jolin. I live here in the Florida Keys. I work on the water, and I'm representing that community of people who do. I had so much to say until I heard Robert Hogue's depressing presentation about sea level rise. And I'm kidding. I still have a lot to say. Melanie, you mentioned the beauty of our water in the Keys, and thank you for mentioning that. I'm so glad you had a chance to learn about the efforts that we've made as a community, not only our government, on the part of the government, but here as locals, to improve our nearshore water. And we are proud of it. It's been a Herculean effort. It is part of the irony here in the Keys. Nearshore, the water looks absolutely beautiful. And yet I can take you on a very short boat ride into the Florida Bay and look at lots of dead seagrass and find that sulfuric smell of rotting grass. So it's an irony, and it's actually one of the challenges we have here in the Florida Keys to engage people in this conversation about preserving the Florida Bay. In the interest of time, among the many concerns we have pertaining to the work that you do, I do want to comment on the area to clean the water in Florida Bay. I trust that you'll be vigilant in paying attention to the component as we move forward. And I would conclude by thanking you for making the trek to the Florida Keys. I certainly appreciate it and appreciate your volunteer work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Kara?
Hi, good afternoon. Kara Kapp for the National Parks Conservation Association. I certainly appreciate being able to meet here in Marathon, knowing that this area is the ultimate recipient of so much of the restoration work, either the benefits with our progress or the detriment with delays that unfortunately do happen. I haven't been this far south since the storms. I came into Islamorada last night, and as we were making the rest of the way down, it was just really eye-opening to see how much damage remains. I was really especially concerned. I'd not heard that figure that Terry shared about 60% of mangrove damage in Everglades National Park in Florida Bay. That's really scary as we come into our next hurricane season, because we know those mangrove shorelines really help protect our communities. As we speak, some of my MPCA colleagues are touring the damage at U.S. Virgin Islands National Park, which still continues. And of course, they didn't have the benefit of those hard mangrove shorelines and the areas of the Everglades that help protect us, so their damage is pretty significant. We do know that advancing Everglades restoration is our first line of defense against storm impacts in the years ahead on Florida. We see about 2 weeks ago supporting the district's plan, and we heard a lot of words of support from decision makers, Senator Nelson, Senator Rubio, many others. It's going to be important to turn those words of support into federal dollars. Like Mr. Moran, I am very concerned about not only the president's budget request, but the congressional funding allocations for Everglades projects, which have fallen far short of the $200 million mark. I think the president requested $67 million, and Congress gave about $10 million more than that. So they're lagging behind. I know it's your priority, Mr. Chair. to seek more congressional funds, and just know that that's a big priority for MPCA as well, and we'll continue to be partners in this effort. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Celeste.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and governing board members. It's funny because when I go after Kara, I have to reorganize my thoughts so I don't say some of the same things, but we work together very well. So I'll echo some of her comments, but the one thing that I wanted to reference is that when I saw there was a meeting in the Keys, I was very glad because it was very timely that there was a presentation on the updates of the algae blooms in Florida Bay. When the hurricane hit, our team got out there the next day. In fact, there were some of the photos there that came from our science team going to check on the conditions of the bay. And the one thing that we noticed is that there was a clear lack of understanding of how algae blooms happen in this part of the system. And so we took it upon ourselves to work with our partners at the Everest Foundation and put together an article in the Keys Life magazine to explain what had happened and the reason why we have these algae blooms and the seagrass die-offs, because in this southern part of the system is very different from what we see up north. But Terry explained it really well, and we try to echo those remarks, and I'll send that to Tia if you haven't seen it so you can read it. But the key of the issue is the fact that we don't get enough fresh water in Florida Bay. And so that kicks up everything else that follows, the seagrass die-offs and then the subsequent algae blooms. And it really does highlight the importance of the district's role in restoration, in getting the water to the recipient end of the Everglades system. And, you know, I was down by the 332D structure not too long ago with our science team, and I saw restoration in progress. I saw, it was maybe a couple of months ago, and it was pretty dry, and just seeing the water come out of that S332D pump and hydrating the frog pond was really impressive. And so I just took my cell phone out and I tweeted about it because it was really great, you know, and that type of work needs to be shared with the public more, because as much as there is Everglades fatigue, there's also progress, and we have a lot of those projects ramping up in the southern end that are coming to fruition really, really soon. And with that, that's why Audubon is so invested in tying all of those projects of the southern end system into one combined operational plan. And I think, Kara, the concerns that we have, but there's also opportunity. And, you know, we were part of a group of organizations request for supplemental hurricane funding to Congress, and the Seepage will be part of it, because we recognize that there is a way to accommodate both the surrounding landowners, but also the environment. We want to make sure that we are looking at all of the solutions. But part of this process moving forward really has to look at what are the impacts of not moving enough fresh water down to the Florida Keys. What are the impacts of using structures like the S197 that we have completed, that we have repeated about the negative effects that it has on the actual Keys ecology. So I hope that as we move forward down with this process, that we're part of those conversations with you, and we can partner to move forward this type of solution. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Celeste. Just a brief comment here. I want to thank all the members of the public, Elizabeth, Karen, Celeste, for providing a good amount of insight into the concerns of not just the local community, but our national partners at large. You know, to Elizabeth, I mentioned that, you know, we're down here for a reason. We clearly value the feedback, and I'd hope to, in the future, work with staff to have some workshops set up so we can better describe the functionality and the operations of a post-SB10 environment. And obviously, to Kara and Celeste, I want to thank you folks, your organizations, and for teaming up with us to continue to push many of the issues that we've discussed at the federal level forward, and I look forward to continuing that communication. Sorry, Celeste. All right. Moving along to our staff reports, beginning with our monthly financial reports that are called Dr. Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very lovely blouse.
What was that?
Mr. Chair, I would nominate Mrs. Bradshaw for the Purple Award.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Even the nails.
Absolutely.
The monthly financial report for March was in your packet. The district's financial situation is sound. We are ahead in our ad valorem collections, And as you heard, the revenue collections from our investment earnings are at $4.5 million as of the end of March, and that's about 24.6% of what we projected. So in conclusion, we foresee no financial issues at all. Thank you.
Now on to the general counsel's report. I'd like to call Mr. Ricardo to discuss a few matters.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I have two items today. On the first item, I seek delegation from the board, delegated authority, so that I can settle an outstanding legal matter with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and that's related to construction of the L8 flow equalization basin, or FEB. That's a feature that came online last June, to be precise, and it's, by all accounts, an absolutely successful project and an important part of restoration strategies. But you may recall, prior to project completion, that we had difficulties with the custom manufactured pumps for the facility. And those pumps are unlike anything else we have in our system. They're unique. And so we had to replace those pumps, or the contractor had to replace those pumps prior to operation. They had to be remanufactured. And that remanufacturing, as a consequence of that, we completed the project 6 months behind the schedule set out in a consent order with the Florida DEP. I wanted to point this out. This is something Mr. Harlow and I talked about. And so I want to make this clear. When we closed out the construction aspect of that project with the contractor, we settled all the claims with them. We settled up for delays and overages, and in settling up, we ended up several $1 million under budget. So while we were 6 months late, it netted out very favorably to the district, and I think we've rolled over those millions of dollars into other restoration strategies projects. But nonetheless, we have to work with DEP to resolve the consent order issue, and we've been talking with the department for the last year. And if there's one thing that's clear, it's clear that they are not going to excuse us from those 6 months. So rather than proceeding by paying stipulated penalties, or what I'm proposing is I'd like to explore with the department the option or an alternative of settling by funding an environmental project in lieu of those penalties. So if you're willing, and we'll need a motion and a vote on this, I'd like for you to delegate that authority for me to work with DE to settle this matter.
All right, board questions or comments? Melanie?
I just want to clarify, and maybe you can just clarify just for the public, because we've sort of been involved in this, and maybe if somebody's watching this or hearing this and they don't understand what we were doing at the L8, I just want to clarify that the pump station that is at the L8 is a one-of-a-kind, never been constructed before pump. So when we say we were 6 months behind because we had issues with the pump and there were modifications and repairs that need to be made to this pump, it wasn't like you could just go back to a manufacturer that makes thousands of these for other people around the world. They were literally fabricating this specifically for this site and for this purpose. So I just want the public to understand that, yes, we tried at all costs to avoid any kind of delays, construction delays, but when you're fabricating on site, and particularly for something that's never been built before, and I've said this many times on this dais, that we're doing things that no one in the world has done before. And so I just want to give a little context to what has happened here. And I appreciate the creativity of your team in finding a way to, rather than just pay money as a fine, to go back and take that amount. And I like the fact that we have that ability to do so and fund another project. So I'm in favor of that. I would move that forward if no one has any further discussion, but that's my 2 cents on that.
Anyone else want to comment, sir?
No, but I would agree, and I would second that.
Before we move on, I should wrap up the action motion. I want to ask if we have any public comment. Okay, so we have a motion by Melanie and Jim, right in second. All in favor? Opposed?
He's with us.
He was an aye. Sorry, a little bit of delay there, folks. Okay, so motion passes unanimously, and I encourage you again in your efforts. I think it would be great if you can turn this delay into something positive for the environment.
Great, I appreciate that.
Online.
The second item I have is informational in nature. I want to inform the governing board of a legal action that was recently filed in Martin County and seek feedback on a proposed course of action that your legal team has developed. So on April 17th, last April 17th, Martin County filed a lawsuit in Martin County Court naming the Martin County tax collector, the Martin County property appraiser, and naming two of the local drainage districts that you all are familiar with, Palomar and Hope St. Lucie. And the purpose of that lawsuit is Martin County would like to have a judge decide whether a local drainage district can assess drainage taxes on county-owned land. And this is very similar to what you all have dealt with in the past 2 years, where your counsel's office has advised you that it's improper that those local drainage districts assess those same drainage taxes on district, or water management district-owned land. So it's a straight legal issue. The premise on the local drainage districts start from the premise that they have authority under Chapter 298 Florida statutes to assess lands belonging to the state. And Martin County and the Water Management District has taken the position that the lands that we own, either jointly, because we do own lands jointly, or individually, are not lands that belong to the state of Florida. So Martin County expects that this is a lawsuit that will be decided at the summary judgment level, which means it's just a threshold legal issue pertaining to local drainage district authority. And so I'm inclined to intervene in this action. It is something we can handle in-house through our Office of Counsel. But before I go down that path, I want to see if there's any questions or any feedback from the board. I'll tell you that the thought process is that we really should get certainty for this water management district. You might recall that the local drainage districts throughout our district levy about $1 million worth of assessments and taxes on our land. We have not been asked to pay all of that because some of our leaseholders pay. But when that land comes out of lease and goes for a project, I mean, we would ultimately be responsible for $1 million. So I'd like to get some certainty from the court on whether we are correct in our legal position. And just sitting out of it, even if Martin County gets a favorable ruling, it shouldn't be clear necessarily whether that's applicable to the Water Management District, because we're not in the case. So Martin County certainly doesn't need us, but they welcome us. And I think it's the best course of action to intervene and get this thing wrapped up. So if there's any questions, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, do we have any questions or comments for Brian? Please, Jimmy.
Yeah, what, if they aren't successful, what is the potential financial impact on the district if this law is applied to us as well? So if the laws apply to us, that's where that $1 million comes into play. With right now, the way we have some lands leased out and others not, we pay somewhere around $700,000 to $800,000 of that million. Not all of that's in Martin County. In Martin County, I think we're looking at about $330,000. Is there a chance that other municipalities could jump in on this concept of taxing us in other parts of our district? Taxing us, those other local water control districts, we do have issues in Palm Beach County and in Glades County. I think the Palm Beach County tax collector is watching this case very closely, and I think that if the Martin County Court decides that those local drainage districts don't have the authority to assess land, I think the Palm Beach County tax collector will fall in line with that, which will alleviate a big dispute that we have in Palm Beach County. But there is a great potential if we don't join this lawsuit to have a financial burden on us. If we don't join this lawsuit, we will have no more certainty than we had yesterday. Right. I would continue to recommend not to pay the assessments and the taxes, but it'd be nice to have this wrapped up. Right. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Moran.
And I certainly support this endeavor on your behalf, or on behalf of the district through your department, if for no other reason than to further establish that we're not a state agency, but an agency of the state.
There you go. I knew you'd appreciate that, sir.
Thank you.
All right, so I think I have good input, and I will proceed. That wraps up my council's report, unless there's anything else for me.
Okay, so just to be clear, unless any other board member objects, and I'm not hearing objections, we are concurring with Brian and asking that you please proceed with his plans, correct? Thank you all.
Thank you.
Brian. At this time, I do want to, this is typically not done, but I do want to take an opportunity to briefly reopen general public comment, because we are down here in the Keys, and a lot of our stakeholders don't always have the opportunity to come up to West Palm. I know that I believe we have Mr. Ross. Ross, what's your name? Last name, how do I pronounce that? Busek. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And
Fisheries entirely catch and release. It is extremely lucrative, generates just under $500 million per year in economic impact for Monroe County. At Bone Fish and Tarpon Trust, we operate under the premise that healthy habitats equal healthy fisheries, meaning if our habitats are degraded, our fisheries and the money they generate will decline. We acknowledge that for our habitats and our habitats to be healthy, Florida Bay must be functional. That means Florida Bay receives the proper amount of fresh water, that water is received at the right time, and that water is free of contaminants. As you've already heard today, and as you're all aware, that Florida Bay is not receiving enough fresh water. This fresh water, the lack of fresh water rather, is making the system very vulnerable to catastrophic ecological change from droughts. Droughts cause acres of seagrass to die. That seagrass rots, which feeds algal blooms. And those algal blooms then move around with winds and tides and can even be tracked with satellite imagery going out to underneath our bridges and out to our reef tract, turning Florida Bay really in from a money-generating asset through fisheries to an injury to our Florida Keys economy that affects not only our fisheries but other sources of natural resources that are important for our revenue. So at Bone Fish and Tarpon Trust, we appreciate your work, and we acknowledge that the construction of the EEAA reservoir is a step in the right direction, one of the first steps in many to resolving this problem in Florida Bay. What we want to speak to you today about, or just acknowledge, is the idea that to restore Florida Bay, we need to restore all the sources of fresh water that reaches the bay. That includes the Shark River. Sound science from academic institutions that have spent 30 years researching how Florida Bay functions have showed through multiple mechanisms that fresh water comes not only through Taylor Slough and multiple outlets in the mainland, but also comes in through the Shark Slough, wraps around Cape Sable into Flamingo Channel, hydrating the western portion of the bay. So with this scientific evidence in mind, it's important that this is acknowledged and incorporated into restoration strategies for Florida Bay restoration to be successful and for the bay to be rehydrated. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and we appreciate you coming down here and listening to us on the Keys.
thank you for your most excellent contributions. We do appreciate that. And I'm also happy that you recognize that SB 10 is a part of a much larger effort that all stakeholders are engaged in. And I can most assuredly tell you our staff fully is committed. It's fully committed to seeing them through to its fruition. And I really do hope that we can see SB 10 as a component and really rally together to finish their remaining projects as well. And appreciate that they have a value. Our IDS means something beyond building reservoirs. So thank you for joining us. I'm happy you've had this opportunity, and I encourage you to continue to engage with us. As I mentioned in the past, we will try to set up additional opportunities down here, whether it's workshops or even participating on your workshop or someone else's, to continue this dialogue. Thank you.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. At this point in time, I'd like to call on Marks, Executive Director of the Board.
Thank you, sir. We've seen many things today, one of which the ceremonial passing of the purple jacket. Mr. Harlow has lost his powers of reuse. They have now been transferred to you. So as our new superhero on the board, I'd like to also acknowledge a couple other superheroes. So Miss Gina, Miss Rosie, Miss Tia, for all the work that they do, especially when we're on the road. They put a lot of effort into this, so I'd like to show my appreciation to them. I would also, and it's a shame because most of our elected officials have left, I was going to call upon them to ban suits in the Keys. Many of my folks know that I hate ties, but then when I'm down in the Keys and I have to wear a suit, I feel especially bad. So I was hoping that they would take up some local ordinance to only provide an exception for weddings, funerals, or public shamings. So from my standpoint, hopefully they look back upon this in a rerun on our website and are able to take that and run with it. I would fully support them. Might even move to Monroe County to cast my vote. So, Mr. Moran, we spoke earlier about the issues of federal funding. I did want to let everybody know that we have generated a letter. That letter will be going to General Semonite, requesting him to address this issue, particularly with the details that we have, and then assuming were we to get an answer that was not favorable, then Mr. Chairman, I would propose to work with you to send a follow-up letter to Mr. R.B. James, the Assistant Secretary of the Army, addressing the issue as well. And then last but not least, at the last meeting and my closing comments, I had told you that I would provide you information on development of this year's budget, so you should have those materials in your packet. In particular, there is a look at a 5-year plan on expenditures for non-recurring funds, as well as a plan for some of the recurring funds that we have. And I look forward to meeting with you all individually over the next 7 months as we develop the July budget. And that's all I have for remarks.
Excellent, thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to open the floor for any additional governing board input.
Okay, bear with me. Gosh, we talked about a lot today, and what a robust meeting down here in the Keys, and I think it's just been so beneficial to hear from people down here, and it just follows along with what is happening with us trying to get WRDA and get all of our projects together. Just want to touch on one of Celeste's comments about the Florida Bay algal blooms. We do have a section of our website that is dedicated to the Florida Bay. I believe there's extensive information about algal blooms and why they occur and what they're doing on that site. So I know that there was a mention of that no one was understanding what was going on, but there is extensive information on that page from our team of scientists that I think includes over 80 PhDs that have been studying that. So the public can go to our website. And I think one of the greatest things about revamping our website is, you know, I was at a task force meeting in Palm Beach County, a water resources task force meeting, and people were asking questions about the Loxahatchee River Plan, and I pulled up on my phone our website and said, here's the link, you can follow this along, you can get all your questions answered. If you have further questions, you can email staff, you can call me. So it's just been a great opportunity for the public to really have real-time access to our science, our data, our staff. So I want to thank everybody involved with that. The Tarpon Trust is a very cool organization that I just learned about because they have their own television show hosted by Tom Brokaw on, I think it's the Travel Channel or the Outdoor Channel?
I'm not even sure.
I think it's the Outdoor Channel. Anyway, find it on your TV. It is a very cool TV show, and I really appreciate the fact that they're getting the information out to the public at large on this television show about how fantastic our fisheries are and how important conservation efforts are for this part of the world and for our backyard. And so to extend on that, I would ask, with the permission of the chair and the staff, that, you know, in our packets, I don't know if you guys realize, but there's 3 letters here that Ernie had alluded to before. Okay, we've got, you know, the Corps has said we're not getting any funding for some of these projects. Well, having a comment passed like the Corps has said this, and getting 3 letters stamped that look like this, that say specifically for Maud Waters, for Indian River Lagoon South, SERP, Melaleuca eradication, Picayune, and Site 1, that they're calling these out, and I would ask that we put this on our website so that the public can see. It's not just the Corps saying they're not gonna do this. They have written us not 1, but 3 letters. I would also ask that they're getting ready to send to all these letters, and then that letter and these letters also be disseminated to the congressional delegations and all the stakeholders, so that when we're all here fighting for the same cause, that we're realizing where the buck stops here. We can fund all these projects. We can sit here and go over data and have meetings and discussions and model and come up with all these great projects. But if we can't get this handled, and we can't get past this, the funding, on their side, because we can't do it without them. It's not like we can just go and take these projects over. They don't necessarily allow us to do that. We've gotten away with that, I think, twice. Twice? Once recently. 1.5. I'll go with that.
Some we don't tell them about.
So, you know, it is a very frustrating thing, and I can appreciate as a member of the public coming here and being frustrated as well and talking with us, and we appreciate that frustration because we feel it as well. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about where the problem lies at this point, and the problem is federal funding. And so we all have to work together to rattle the cages up there and get this dealt with, because getting letters like this that say there's zero funding in the fiscal year for projects that they committed to and that we have already funded and built and done our part, in order to get fresh water to Florida Bay, we've got to have mod waters. And it's saying right here, $0 mod waters, April 9th, 2018. So I find that to be a big problem, and I think the public really should be aware of it. I don't think anyone's written that in the newspapers, so I think we should put it on our website, and we should make the public aware of it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I have just one in response to Melanie. I absolutely agree with her position on this, and I think that, you know, messaging is such a big part of this. So I do believe that we should include that information and make it available to the public in a very readily available and digestible manner, so you don't have to go through a FOIA request or all these other lovely issues that Brian tends to wrestle with. So that being said, I do want to draw, it's not really a point of distinction, it's just something to add to that comment. In the work that Ernie and I have performed, I have come to recognize that we are starting to develop some fantastic, especially with the Corps here locally and moving up through the Jacksonville office. As it stands, you know, there's been a lot of changes that have taken place in Washington, D.C. And I do feel that we're going to gain a lot more traction in the coming months and coming years because we have that cohesive understanding with our local representatives from the Corps and our state and regional folks as well. So we'll continue to keep you abreast of that. Again, you know, I think it's an excellent point that Melanie makes, and I would encourage staff to make that information readily available. Mr. Moran.
Yes, very briefly, I do want to confirm Ms. Peterson's remarks, but it's not the Corps, it's the Congress. You know, it's not that the Corps is not doing their job. They can't do the job if they don't get the money. You know, and a perfect example of it is this SB 10 project. We've spent a lot of money and our time and effort over the last months developing our initial portion of the SB 10 project, and that would all be in vain if our federal partners don't fund it. And you know, there has to be a better way to do this.
Mr. Chair, could I jump in really quickly there? So I think partially Congress, but I think that the Corps has to ask for the funding first. And from our standpoint, the way that these agreements have been viewed is as a reimbursement instead of as a contractual obligation. And so from our standpoint, we're looking for the Corps to responsibly budget for this. We have seen over the past couple years that the budget for the overall CNSF project has gone up, while our budget has remained, or they've asked for zero. So I think the way that they do their budgeting, they are paying off other obligations before they arrive at a $0 amount for the year, and then they tell us they don't have any money for us. We're looking for both a policy, I think, and a funding clarification so that we are not put at the end of the train, but at the beginning of the train with their other obligations, and then, of course, having Congress provide the money for the funding.
I'm sorry, sir.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was just trying to not damage our relationship with the Corps.
as to follow up on Ms. Moran's comment regarding the involvement of our legislature, and especially our congressional delegation, and following up on documentation, we've got some excellent communications and commitments from our delegation, recognizing that mod waters, similar projects that really do help true southern conveyance on a much larger scale happen. That is first and foremost at the top of their mind. So Congress is listening. It's our job to continue the messaging and to work with not just our staff, but all of our stakeholders to recognize the benefits that ultimately our friends down here in the Keys are in need of, and we all need. So, I'll get with Ernie, and we'll also add to that list of documentation some other communications we may want to publish, which I know our friends in the NGO community do have, and so on and so forth. But just to tell a more complete story in a manner that's very digestible. But Jim, I think you're spot on. It's a two-part test. We've got to work with our friends at the Corps, and we also got to work with the folks that we voted into office and get the most out of them, because we are a unique agency and we're sitting in a unique environment, and that does put us in the limelight. Let's use that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as Ms. Peterson was saying what she was saying, I was quiet over here applauding because I feel the same way and totally agree. And I would ask that our local media, from the Miami Herald on up the coast to the Stuart News and my neck of the woods, that they would be equally as critical and observant of what our federal partners are not doing as they are about things that we are doing that they seem to always have trouble with. But we're doing everything I believe we can and then some. And when we don't have that participation, I don't even have ever in the last year seen anything negative about what our federal partners do in the process. But there's a lot of negative and questioning going on about what we do in this process. So I would ask that they pick up on what you said, that they would show these things to the public and educate the public, and then that would put the pressure on our delegations to take action beyond what it is that we do as well. So thank you, Melanie, for that. And lastly, in the spirit of things, when we were talking about the issue with the Seminole tribe, my mind was on a million different things, but I wanted to thank staff. I wanted to thank Jennifer, and I wanted to thank Brian and Ernie and Toby. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of work done by a very long process. I know I've asked a lot of staff in this process being involved in it, and I want to thank the Seminole tribe and the council as well, and Chairman Osceola and everyone that's been participating in this. So I just wanted to extend that and acknowledge that. Thank you, sir.
Just one thing to add. I too had a fantastic session with our friends from the tribe just yesterday, and I plan on following up with that. I mean, because this is clearly a complex issue. This is just a starting point. We're taking care of our own housekeeping on it. As you well know, we will proceed to assist where we can beyond the issues involving flood control and looking at water as a resource as well. So great job, Brandon, on your end in working through these problems. And thank you for that. Jamie, do you have a comment? Mr. Barber. Sir? Okay, we're getting there, almost there. Here it is. All right, so before we adjourn, I'd like to again thank Mr. Robert Spotswood for the use of this facility and its gracious staff, Andrea Robinson and April Ross. The City of Marathon for the use of their commission chambers for yesterday's Project and Lands Committee meeting, Monroe County officials for providing presenters at our meetings, and District IT staff, some unsung heroes here. Thank you for making that possible. Angela Fretwell, who coordinated all of our AV needs with SMP Productions and Hyatt staff. That being said, do we have a motion to adjourn? Do we have a second? All in favor? Thank you, Dan. We are adjourned.